In the gentle twilight between waking and dreams, where shadows lengthen and whispers of the past drift through corridors of memory, we find ourselves drawn to a time when the world moved to different rhythms. If you enjoy drifting through these ancient stories of human resilience and forgotten wisdom, consider joining us for more tales that echo through the ages. Tonight we venture into the misty realm of medieval Europe, where strange laws governed daily life, where Viking longships carved paths through treacherous waters, and where ancient traditions bound communities together like threads in an endless tapestry. Close your eyes and let the firelight dance behind your eyelids as we journey back through centuries, following the footsteps of those who came before us. Picture yourself in a world where morning light filters through wooden shutters, where the scent of wood smoke mingles with the earthen smell of thatched roofs, and where every dawn brings both hope and hardship in equal measure. This is a world where survival demanded not just strength, but wisdom coded into laws that might seem strange to our modern eyes, yet carried within them the accumulated knowledge of generations who learned to endure against overwhelming odds. The cobblestones beneath our feet are worn smooth by countless footsteps, each one belonging to someone who woke each morning wondering if they would see another sunset. Their stories whisper to us across the centuries, carrying lessons wrapped in the strange customs and curious rules that govern their days and nights. In this realm of shadows and firelight, we begin our journey with a peculiar awakening. You roll from your bed, or rather from the pile of straw that serves as your resting place, your body aching from the hard surface that has cradled your sleep. The morning light creeps through gaps in wooden walls, painting golden streaks across the dirt floor where you stand, contemplating the day ahead. Perhaps today will be different, you think as you eye that scrap of fine fur you discovered at yesterday's market. The merchant's stall had been filled with such treasures, silks that shimmered like captured sunlight, velvets that seemed to hold the depth of midnight skies. In your hands, that piece of fur feels like possibility itself, soft and warm and speaking of a life beyond the endless cycle of mud and toil that defines your existence. But as you lift the fur to your shoulders, imagining how it might transform your appearance, how it might lift you from the ranks of the ordinary into something approaching dignity, the weight of ancient law settles upon you like a heavy cloak. The sumptuary laws of medieval Europe were not mere suggestions whispered by distant nobles. They were iron chains wrapped in silk, binding each person to their appointed place in the great hierarchy of existence. These laws emerged from a world where order hung by the thinnest of threads, where the collapse of social distinction could mean the collapse of civilization itself. Imagine a society where your clothing served as your identification card, where a single glance could tell any observer your place in the world, your rights, your limitations, your very worth as measured by those who ruled from their stone towers. For you, standing in that dim morning light with fur between your fingers, the law speaks with absolute clarity. Peasants wear wool, scratchy and dull, the color of earth and sadness. The texture against your skin serves as a constant reminder of your station, each fiber a small rebellion quelled before it could begin. The brown and grey hues mirror the mud-stained world you inhabit, ensuring that even in a crowd, even at a distance, your identity remains unmistakable. Meanwhile, in chambers warmed by great hearths and lit by expensive candles, nobles drape themselves in silk so vibrant it seems to glow with inner light. Purple flows across their shoulders like liquid royalty, while ermine trims their cloaks with the pure white of winter clouds. These are not merely clothes but proclamations, statements of divine right and inherited power that speak louder than any herald's trumpet. The enforcement of these laws carries the weight of the kingdom itself. Inspectors move through market squares and feast halls, their eyes trained to spot the subtlest violations. A hem too ornate, a color too bold, a fabric too fine, and suddenly you find yourself dragged before magistrates whose judgments carry the force of divine authority. The punishments range from fines that could impoverish a family for generations to public humiliation that marks you as a violator of the sacred order. Consider the tragic comedy of a farmer fined for wearing a cloak that shimmers too brightly in candlelight, or a merchant's wife imprisoned because her dress displays colors reserved for duchesses. These are not tales of whimsy but records of a world where appearance carried the weight of law, where fashion was politics, and where stepping outside your assigned role could bring consequences that rippled through entire communities. Yet beneath these harsh restrictions lay a logic born of centuries of upheaval and uncertainty. In a world where kings rose and fell with the seasons, where plagues could empty entire cities, and where warfare was as common as harvest time, stability required visible markers of order. If a duchess could not be distinguished from a dairymaid, if a duke might be confused with a dung collector, then how could society function? How could authority be maintained? How could the delicate balance between ruler and ruled be preserved? The sumptuary laws served as a bulwark against chaos, a visual language that everyone could read regardless of their literacy. They created a world where social mobility was not just difficult but literally invisible, where ambition was constrained, not merely by opportunity but by the very clothes upon one's back. In this system, rebellion began with the desire for a better cloak, and revolution could start with the audacity to wear silk. As you stand there in the growing daylight, the fur heavy in your hands, you understand that this is not merely about fashion or vanity. This is about accepting your place in a world that offers few choices, where survival often depends upon conformity, and where the simple act of dressing each morning becomes a meditation on power, privilege, and the invisible chains that bind society together. The fur slips from your fingers, falling to the earthen floor like a discarded dream. You reach instead for the familiar roughness of wool, feeling its coarse weave against your palms. This is your uniform, your identity, your protection against a world that punishes those who dare to rise above their station. As you wrap the brown cloth around your shoulders, you become invisible again, blending into the great mass of humanity that toils and suffers and endures beneath the gaze of those whose silk garments mark them as chosen by God and circumstance. But even as you accept this daily defeat, even as you step into the role assigned to you by birth and law, something within you remembers the softness of that fur, the possibility it represented. Perhaps that memory will warm you through the cold days ahead, a small flame of dignity that no law can entirely extinguish. Perhaps in dreams you will wear purple and walk among nobles, if only until the morning bell calls you back to your wool and your proper place in the great tapestry of medieval life. The morning light grows stronger now, and with it comes the sound that governs all waking hours in this ancient world. The bell tower rises above the village like a stone finger pointing toward heaven, and from its height comes the bronze voice that rules every moment of your existence. The sound rolls across thatched roofs and cobblestone streets, penetrating wooden walls and earthen floors, calling every soul within its reach to attention. Curfew, they call it, though the word carries meanings that stretch far beyond its French origins. Cover your fire, the ancient phrase whispers, but the command encompasses so much more than the simple act of banking coals. It speaks to the fundamental relationship between community and individual, between safety and freedom, between the collective good and personal desire. Picture the scene as evening approaches. Smoke rises from 100 chimneys, carrying the sense of cooking meals and warming hearths into the darkening sky. Children play in narrow streets while adults finish the day's work, and for a few precious moments life feels almost peaceful. Then the bell begins its evening song, its bronze voice cutting through conversations and laughter like a sword through silk. At that sound, a transformation begins. Candles flicker and die as if blown out by an invisible wind. Hearth fires sink into glowing embers as dirt and ash are carefully spread across their surface. Windows that glowed with warm light grow dark one by one, until the entire village seems to exhale its last breath of illumination and settle into enforced slumber. This is not merely about fire safety, though fire remains the silent predator that stalks every medieval settlement. In a world built of wood and thatch, where walls are thin and roofs are dry, where water comes from distant wells and firefighting consists of little more than prayer and buckets, a single stray ember can transform a thriving community into a field of ash before dawn. The curfew bell stands as guardian against this ever-present threat, its nightly call a reminder that individual comfort must sometimes bow to collective survival. But consider the deeper implications of this enforced darkness. When the bells ring and the fires die, more than light disappears from the world. Privacy vanishes as families crowd together in the single warm space that remains. Productivity ceases as craftsmen set aside their needles and hammers, unable to work by the feeble light of banked coals. Social interaction contracts to whispered conversations between family members, while the broader community dissolves into isolated households waiting for dawn. The wealthy, of course, enjoy certain privileges that ease the burden of curfew. Their stone houses resist fire more effectively than wooden huts. Their multiple hearths provide options that peasants lack, and their servants ensure that no flame burns unattended through the dangerous hours of night. Yet even they must bow to the bell's authority, dimming their grand halls and retiring earlier than their desires might dictate. For you, huddled in your single room with family members whose breathing fills the darkness around you, curfew brings a unique form of intimacy. Stories emerge from the shadows as voices take the place of sight. Children listen to tales passed down through generations, while adults share the gossip and concerns that daylight renders too dangerous to speak aloud. In this enforced togetherness, families discover aspects of each other that busy daylight hours usually obscure. Yet the darkness also brings terrors that candlelight normally keeps at bay. Sounds take on new meanings when sight fails, and every creak of timber, every scratch at the window, every distant cry becomes pregnant with possibility and fear. Wild animals roam more boldly after dark, while human predators find opportunity in the universal blindness that curfew imposes. The night becomes a realm apart, governed by different rules and haunted by different dangers. Sleep, when it finally comes, carries the weight of helplessness. If fire breaks out while you slumber, if thieves approach your door, if illness strikes a family member, the darkness limits your options and amplifies your vulnerability. You rest at the mercy of forces beyond your control, trusting in luck and divine protection to see you safely through to morning's light. The psychological impact of this nightly ritual extends far beyond its practical purposes. Curfew teaches submission to authority, acceptance of limitation, and the primacy of community needs over individual desires. It creates a rhythm of life that acknowledges human frailty and the need for collective discipline. In a world where chaos lurks always at the edges of civilization, the bell tower becomes a lighthouse of order, its bronze voice a beacon calling society back from the precipice of anarchy. As you lie in the darkness, listening to the settling sounds of a village gone quiet, you might reflect on this strange bargain that medieval life demands. Safety purchased with freedom, survival bought with submission, community preserved through individual sacrifice. The curfew bell that seems to imprison you also protects you, and in its nightly call lies the wisdom of generations who learned that sometimes the greatest liberty comes from accepting necessary limitations. Morning will come, as it always does, and with it the lifting of darkness, both literal and metaphorical. But until then, you rest in the embrace of enforced night, a member of a community that chooses collective security over individual autonomy, that values tomorrow's survival over tonight's convenience. In this choice lies one of the fundamental truths of medieval existence, that in a world of constant peril, even freedom must sometimes sleep. The dawn light creeps through shuttered windows like a shy visitor, uncertain of its welcome. As consciousness returns and the night's enforced slumber retreats before the advancing day, your body reminds you of its most basic need. Hunger gnaws at your belly like a persistent beast, and your thoughts turn inevitably toward the kitchen, toward sustenance, toward the eternal question that haunts every medieval morning: what will there be to eat? But as you contemplate the day's first meal, as your mind conjures images of roasted pork or fresh bread, still warm from the oven, the weight of religious law settles upon you like a familiar burden. Today is Friday, and Friday means fish, whether your soul craves it or not, whether your body needs it or not, whether your purse can afford it or not. The dietary restrictions of medieval Europe were not suggestions offered by kindly priests concerned for spiritual welfare. They were commands backed by divine authority and earthly punishment, woven into the very fabric of daily existence like threads in a tapestry that could not be removed without destroying the whole. Nearly half the calendar lay under the shadow of fasting laws, turning the simple act of choosing a meal into a meditation on obedience, sacrifice, and the complex relationship between flesh and spirit. Imagine opening your larder on such a morning and finding it transformed by invisible barriers. The salted pork that might have flavored your morning meal becomes forbidden fruit, as untouchable as if it were poison. The dried beef that could sustain you through hours of labor might as well be locked behind cathedral doors. Even the eggs from your own chickens become symbols of indulgence that your faith demands you resist. In their place stands the pale flesh of fish, caught in distant waters or local streams, preserved in salt that leaves it tough and tasteless, a poor substitute for the meals your body craves. Herring stares at you from your plate with glassy eyes that seem to mock your predicament, while cod flakes apart in your mouth like salted sawdust. The fish market becomes your prison and your salvation, offering sustenance that satisfies the law while leaving your soul as hungry as your stomach. Yet beneath this seemingly arbitrary system of restriction lies a wisdom born of practical necessity rather than pure spiritual desire. Consider the medieval economy, built upon the backs of animals that served multiple purposes throughout their lives. Cows provided milk that could feed families for months. Their strength pulled plows that turned earth into grain. Their hides became leather that protected human skin from weather and wear. To slaughter such valuable creatures merely to satisfy temporary hunger represented a form of economic suicide that communities could not afford. The fasting laws served as a buffer between human desire and agricultural necessity, forcing people to preserve their livestock during the lean months when every animal represented the difference between survival and starvation. Pigs, sheep and cattle could thus live longer, breed more successfully, and provide greater long-term benefit to communities that learned to moderate their immediate appetites in service of future prosperity. The fishing industry, meanwhile, flourished under this system of enforced demand. Coastal communities that might otherwise have struggled to find markets for their catch discovered that religious law created customers across entire kingdoms. Preservation techniques improved as fish needed to travel farther inland, reaching tables in mountain villages and forest settlements where fresh seafood had never before appeared. Trade routes developed around these dietary requirements, connecting distant shores to interior markets through networks of commerce that religious observance made necessary. For the wealthy, of course, the burden fell more lightly. Their kitchens employed cooks skilled in the art of substitution, capable of creating elaborate dishes from permitted ingredients that rivaled the forbidden meals in both flavor and satisfaction. Almond milk replaced dairy, exotic spices transformed simple fish into complex delicacies, and expensive preserving techniques ensured that permitted foods arrived at noble tables in forms that bore little resemblance to their humble origins. But for you, standing in your simple kitchen with limited resources and simpler skills, the fasting laws represent a daily challenge that tests both creativity and patience. How do you transform a piece of salted cod into something that will satisfy a family hungry from dawn labor? How do you explain to children why the chicken in the yard cannot become tonight's dinner, even though their bellies ache with emptiness? How do you find joy in meals that feel more like penance than nourishment? The answer, perhaps, lies in understanding that these restrictions were never intended to be easy. They were designed to remind the faithful that earthly pleasure is temporary, that spiritual discipline requires sacrifice, and that the community of believers shares common burdens that bind them together more strongly than individual satisfaction ever could. Every Friday meal of fish becomes a communion with fellow Christians across the known world, all of whom make the same sacrifice, accept the same limitations and find meaning in shared obedience to divine command. As you prepare your morning meal of herring and hard bread, as you swallow the salt-preserved flesh that tastes more of ocean brine than of nourishment, you participate in a ritual that extends far beyond your simple kitchen. You join a community of faith that spans continents and centuries, united by the common experience of choosing spiritual discipline over bodily comfort, eternal reward over temporary pleasure. The fish bones that you carefully extract from each bite, the scales that sometimes escape cleaning and crunch between your teeth, the lingering taste of preservation salt that no amount of water can entirely wash away, these become sacraments of sorts, reminders that the path to salvation is paved with small sacrifices willingly made. In accepting these discomforts, in finding sustenance where your appetite finds only duty, you demonstrate faith not through grand gestures but through the humble act of eating what you would not choose to eat. finding nourishment where pleasure fears to tread. And so the morning meal concludes, leaving you fed but not satisfied, nourished but not content. The fast day breakfast sits in your stomach like a stone of duty, heavy with obligation but light on joy. Yet perhaps in that heaviness lies its own form of sustenance, the knowledge that you have begun another day by placing divine will above personal desire, community law above individual appetite. In a world where such choices define not only earthly survival but eternal salvation, even the humblest meal of salted fish becomes a feast of spiritual significance. The afternoon sun climbs toward its zenith as you make your way through the forest path, your stomach growling with the memory of that unsatisfying breakfast of salted herring. The morning's sparse meal feels like a distant dream now, and your body craves something more substantial, something that might actually quiet the persistent ache of hunger that shadows your every step. Then you see it, pausing in a shaft of golden sunlight that filters through the canopy above, a rabbit, plump and perfect, its brown fur gleaming with health and its bright eyes alert to the sounds of the forest around it. For a moment the world stands still as your hunter's instincts awaken, calculating distance and opportunity, weighing the satisfaction that such a meal would bring against the energy required to catch it. But even as your hands move instinctively toward the snare at your belt, even as your mind begins planning the approach that might secure this unexpected bounty, the cold weight of reality settles upon your shoulders like an iron cloak. That rabbit, so tantalizingly within reach, might as well be protected by invisible walls of stone and steel. It belongs not to the forest, not to nature, not even to God, but to your Lord, and in medieval Europe, that ownership carries the force of divine commandment and earthly law. The hunting restrictions of the Middle Ages were not gentle suggestions offered by nobles concerned about wildlife conservation. They were absolute prohibitions backed by the full power of feudal authority, transforming every forest into a private preserve where trespass could mean death and poaching could result in punishments that made starvation seem merciful by comparison. The very concept of common land, of resources belonging to the community rather than to individuals, had been swept away by a system that concentrated ownership in the hands of those whose birth and wealth placed them above the desperate calculations of daily survival. Imagine the bitter irony of standing hungry in a forest teeming with life, surrounded by creatures that could feed your family for days, yet forbidden to touch them by laws that recognize no distinction between necessity and greed. The deer that wander through clearings in great herds, the boar that root through undergrowth, leaving clear trails of their passage, the countless birds that fill the air with song and wings, all of these belong to men who feast in distant castles while you gnaw on bread crusts and dream of meat. This system of exclusive hunting rights served multiple purposes in the complex hierarchy of medieval society. For the nobility, hunting provided more than mere recreation. It offered a means of displaying power, of demonstrating dominance over both land and people, of reinforcing the natural order that placed lords above peasants as surely as God placed angels above mortals. When a duke rode through his forests with hounds and hawks, when he brought down a magnificent stag with a perfectly placed arrow, he enacted a ritual of authority that spoke more eloquently than any proclamation or ceremony. The practical enforcement of these laws required a network of forest wardens, gamekeepers, and informants that penetrated every woodland community. These officials carried the authority to search homes, question travelers, and impose immediate punishments upon those caught violating the sacred boundaries between noble privilege and common desperation. A snare found in your possession, a suspicious stain on your clothing, even the testimony of a neighbor seeking favor or revenge, could bring you before judges whose mercy was limited by their duty to preserve the social order through fear. The punishments for poaching reflected the seriousness with which medieval society viewed challenges to property rights and social hierarchy. Minor offenses might result in fines that could impoverish families for generations, while more serious violations could lead to physical mutilation designed to prevent future crimes while serving as visible warnings to potential lawbreakers. The loss of a hand eliminated a person's ability to hunt while marking them permanently as someone who had challenged noble authority. Death sentences, while less common, sent unmistakable messages about the ultimate consequences of refusing to accept one's place in the established order. Yet despite these harsh penalties, poaching continued throughout the medieval period, driven by desperation that made the risk of punishment seem preferable to the certainty of starvation. Entire villages sometimes conspired to organize nighttime hunts, sharing both the risks and the rewards of their illegal activities. Poachers developed elaborate techniques for avoiding detection, from silent snares that killed without sound to coded signals that warned of approaching wardens. These activities created underground communities bound together by shared danger and mutual dependence, parallel societies that operated in the shadows of official law and noble authority. The irony of the hunting laws became most apparent during times of plenty in the natural world and scarcity in human communities. When harsh winters drove deer into villages searching for food, when overpopulation of game animals led to crop damage that threatened agricultural survival, the prohibition against hunting forced communities to watch their own sustenance being destroyed by creatures they were forbidden to kill. Noble hunting parties might slaughter hundreds of animals in single expeditions, not from need but from sport, while peasant families slowly starved within sight of abundance they could not legally touch. For you, standing in that forest clearing with the rabbit just beyond reach, these laws represent more than abstract principles of property and privilege. They embody the daily reality of a world where survival is contingent upon acceptance of inequality, where hunger must be endured while food wanders freely through landscapes owned by others, where the most basic human instinct to hunt for sustenance becomes a crime punishable by death. The rabbit bounds away into the undergrowth, disappearing as quickly as it appeared, leaving you alone with your empty stomach and your law-abiding conscience. The brief fantasy of roasted meat fades like smoke, replaced by the familiar weight of resignation that characterizes so much of medieval existence. You turn away from the forest path and trudge back toward the village, toward another meal of bread and vegetables, toward another night of dreams filled with forbidden feasts. But perhaps something valuable remains from this encounter beyond mere frustration and regret. In choosing to obey the law despite your hunger, in walking away from temptation despite the pain of privation, you participate in the social contract that holds medieval society together. Your restraint, multiplied across thousands of similar moments experienced by countless other people, creates the stability that allows civilization to function even in the face of inequality and injustice. The hunting laws may seem cruel from the perspective of your empty stomach, but they serve the larger purpose of maintaining order in a world always balanced on the edge of chaos. Your sacrifice, your hunger, your obedience to rules that favor others over yourself, these become the building blocks of a society that, however imperfect, provides structure and meaning in a universe where both are precious and fragile commodities. As the shadows lengthen and evening approaches, as the memory of that rabbit grows fainter and the prospect of another simple meal grows nearer, you carry within yourself the knowledge that you have chosen duty over desire, law over appetite, community stability over individual satisfaction. In a world where such choices are made daily by countless people facing similar temptations, where the fabric of society depends upon such small acts of compliance and self-denial, even your moment of hungry restraint becomes part of the greater tapestry of human civilization. The autumn mist rises from the marshlands as you make your way through the village square, your footsteps echoing off wet cobblestones that gleam like black mirrors in the pale morning light. The accusing finger of your neighbor still points toward you in your memory, and the magistrate's stern voice still rings in your ears, pronouncing judgment with the authority of ages. You have been charged with stealing a loaf of bread, and whether you actually committed this crime matters less than you might expect in the strange world of medieval justice. In this realm where divine will intersects with human law, where God serves as both judge and jury, truth is not discovered through careful examination of evidence or lengthy deliberation over witness testimony. Instead, it emerges through ordeal, through tests that subject the accused to physical challenges designed to allow supernatural forces to render verdict through the medium of human flesh. The trial by ordeal represents one of medieval Europe's most distinctive contributions to the art of jurisprudence, a legal system that places absolute faith in divine intervention while requiring human beings to endure consequences that often prove far more severe than the crimes they allegedly committed. Picture yourself standing before the assembled crowd that has gathered to witness this ancient ritual of justice. Faces peer at you from every direction, some filled with curiosity, others with sympathy, many with the kind of morbid fascination that public spectacles have always attracted. These are your neighbors, people who have known you since childhood, yet their expressions suggest that your guilt or innocence will be determined not by their testimony about your character, but by your ability to survive whatever ordeal the court has chosen to impose. The logic underlying this system appears almost crystalline in its simplicity. If you are innocent, then surely divine providence will protect you from harm, allowing you to emerge from the trial unscathed as proof of your righteousness. If you are guilty, then God will permit suffering to befall you, using physical pain as both revelation and punishment. This reasoning transforms every ordeal into a form of prayer made manifest, a direct appeal to heavenly authority that bypasses the uncertainties and corruptions of human judgment. The ordeal by fire stands as perhaps the most dramatic of these tests, requiring the accused to grasp a red-hot iron bar and carry it for a prescribed distance, while judges and spectators observe for signs of divine favor or displeasure. The metal, heated until it glows like a fragment of the sun itself, sears flesh instantly upon contact, filling the air with the acrid smell of burning skin and the sound of anguish that no amount of faith can entirely suppress. Yet you must not only grasp this instrument of torture, but walk with it, demonstrating your confidence in divine protection while your hand slowly transforms into a landscape of blisters and scorched meat. The true test, however, comes not during the ordeal itself, but in the days that follow. Officials wrap your burned hand in cloth and wait 3 days for divine judgment to manifest through the process of healing. If your wounds show signs of recovery, if new skin begins to grow over the damaged tissue, if infection fails to set in, then God has spoken in your favor and your innocence stands proven. But if your hand festers, if the burns deepen rather than heal, if fever and corruption spread through your body, then divine justice has marked you as guilty, and punishment follows as surely as night follows day. The ordeal by water offers a different but equally treacherous path to truth. Bound hand and foot, to prevent any possibility of swimming. You are cast into a pool or river while judges observe whether you sink or float. The reasoning holds that pure water, blessed by God for the baptism of the faithful, will reject the impure flesh of the guilty, causing them to float upon the surface like oil upon wine. The innocent, being pure in the sight of heaven, will be accepted by the water and allowed to sink beneath its surface, though this divine favor may prove indistinguishable from drowning, unless observers act quickly to retrieve the vindicated accused. For those whose guilt or innocence must be determined through combat, the ordeal takes the form of trial by battle, where the accused faces either the accuser or a professional champion in single combat, fighting until God grants victory to the righteous and defeat to the wicked. This system assumes that divine intervention will strengthen the arm of the innocent while weakening the sword of the guilty, though it fails to account for differences in training, experience, physical strength, and plain luck that might influence the outcome of such contests. The psychological impact of these ordeals extends far beyond their immediate physical consequences. To face trial by ordeal requires absolute faith in divine justice coupled with resignation to potentially horrific suffering, a combination that tests spiritual conviction as surely as it tests bodily endurance. The accused must believe not only in their own innocence, but in God's willingness and ability to demonstrate that innocence through miraculous intervention, even as they watch the iron heating in the fire or feel the ropes binding their limbs before the water trial. Yet, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the ordeal system lies in its practical results. In a world without antiseptics or advanced medical knowledge, burns almost inevitably become infected, and drowning victims who survive the initial submersion often succumb to pneumonia or other complications in the days that follow. The system seems designed to produce guilty verdicts through the simple expedient of subjecting human flesh to traumas that medieval medicine cannot adequately treat. The church authorities who administered these trials understood these medical realities better than most, yet they continued to interpret physical suffering as evidence of divine displeasure rather than natural consequence of injury. This interpretation allowed the system to function despite its obvious flaws, creating a form of justice that satisfied the spiritual requirements of the age, while producing practical results that served the needs of those in power. As you stand before the glowing iron, As you feel its heat radiating against your face like the breath of some furnace demon, you must weigh your faith against your fear, your trust in divine protection against your knowledge of human vulnerability. The crowd watches in silence as you extend your hand toward the implement that will determine your fate, their faces reflecting the same mixture of fascination and dread that you feel coursing through your own veins. This moment encapsulates something essential about medieval existence, the constant tension between faith and doubt, between acceptance of divine will and rebellion against human suffering, between community solidarity and individual isolation. In choosing to undergo the ordeal rather than confess to crimes you may not have committed, you place your trust in forces beyond human control while accepting consequences that are all too humanly real. Whether you emerge from this trial vindicated or condemned, whether your hand heals cleanly or rots with infection, whether the crowd that watches today remembers you as innocent or guilty, the experience will mark you permanently as someone who submitted to medieval justice in its purest and most terrible form. You will carry the scars of this day for whatever remains of your life, physical reminders of a legal system that sought truth through suffering and found divine will in human pain. The Sunday morning light streams through the narrow windows of the village church like golden arrows piercing the dim interior, illuminating dust motes that dance in the air like tiny spirits celebrating the day of rest. The bell tower has already released its bronze call across the countryside, summoning the faithful to worship with a voice that brooks no argument and accepts no excuses. Sleep is finished, dreams are banished, and duty calls with the relentless authority that governs every aspect of medieval existence. You rise from your straw mattress feeling the familiar ache in your back that speaks of too much labor and too little comfort. But today brings a different burden than the usual round of agricultural toil. Today is the Sabbath, the day when divine commandment requires rest, reflection, and the kind of spiritual discipline that transforms enforced idleness into sacred obligation. Yet this rest proves more complex and demanding than the hardest day of physical work, hedged about with restrictions and expectations that turn every moment into a test of faith and obedience. The walk to church becomes a procession of the entire community, families emerging from humble cottages and prosperous farmhouses alike, all bound by the same divine mandate to gather in the house of God and participate in rituals that connect earthly existence to eternal salvation. Children clutch their parents' hands while struggling to maintain the proper solemnity that Sunday requires, their natural energy constrained by clothing reserved for holy days and behavior that must reflect the sacred nature of the occasion. Inside the church, the morning service unfolds with the measured cadence of centuries-old tradition. Latin phrases flow from the priest's lips like water from an ancient spring, carrying meanings that most of the congregation cannot fully comprehend, yet accept with the faith of generations who have found comfort in familiar mysteries. The incense rises in fragrant clouds that blur the boundaries between earth and heaven, while candlelight flickers across stone walls carved with images of saints and martyrs who exemplify the Christian virtues that everyone present strives to emulate. But the conclusion of morning worship marks not the end of Sunday's obligations, but the beginning of a different kind of challenge. The same divine law that commands attendance at Mass also prohibits all forms of labor, transforming the day of rest into a carefully regulated period, where every activity must be weighed against religious requirements. The plough that awaits your attention in the field becomes untouchable, as if it were made of molten metal. The loom that could produce cloth for your family's needs stands idle like a shrine to abandoned productivity. Even the repair of your leaking roof must wait for Monday's dawn, despite the steady drip that falls into your cooking pot with monotonous persistence. This enforced idleness serves purposes that extend far beyond simple spiritual observance. In a world where people routinely work themselves into early graves, where the demands of agricultural survival drive families to labor from dawn to dusk 7 days a week, the Sabbath provides a mandatory pause that prevents complete physical and mental exhaustion. The Church, in mandating rest, performs a function that no individual would dare attempt on their own, protecting workers from the relentless demands of masters, landlords, and economic necessity. Yet the prohibition against labor creates its own forms of hardship and frustration. Your landlord still expects his rent whether you work 6 days or 7, and the weeds in your garden continue growing despite your inability to remove them on the day when their removal might be most convenient. The cattle still require feeding, the chickens still need tending, and the basic necessities of life continue their demands regardless of religious calendar. The Church recognizes some of these practical necessities, allowing certain forms of work deemed essential for survival or unavoidable by their very nature. Caring for sick family members, tending to animals, preparing simple meals, and responding to genuine emergencies fall outside the general prohibition against Sunday labor. Yet the line between necessity and convenience remains blurry, subject to interpretation by religious authorities whose understanding of daily hardship may differ significantly from your own experience. The psychological burden of Sabbath observance weighs heaviest on those whose survival depends upon maximizing every opportunity for productive work. When weather cooperates, when crops require immediate attention, when market conditions favor urgent action, the command to rest becomes a form of spiritual discipline that tests faith against practical necessity. You must choose between obedience to divine law and response to temporal opportunity, between spiritual salvation and material survival, between the eternal reward promised by religious observance and the immediate benefits of productive labor. The wealthy, of course, navigate these restrictions with greater ease than their social inferiors. Nobles can delegate essential tasks to servants whose Sabbath obligations may be interpreted more flexibly, while prosperous merchants can afford to lose occasional opportunities in service of religious observance. Their Sunday rest takes place in comfortable surroundings, warmed by fires tended by others, fed by meals prepared by staff whose own spiritual needs receive less consideration than their master's convenience. For you, however, Sunday rest means sitting in a cold cottage, eating simple food prepared the day before, watching helplessly as opportunities slip away like water through cupped hands. The prohibition against work extends to most forms of entertainment as well, leaving you with few options beyond prayer, quiet conversation, and the kind of restless contemplation that accompanies enforced inactivity. Yet perhaps in this very restriction lies the deeper purpose of Sabbath observance. In being forced to stop, to sit still, to resist the constant drive toward productivity that characterizes the rest of the week, you discover aspects of existence that labor tends to obscure. The sound of wind through trees becomes audible when it no longer competes with the noise of human activity. The play of light across familiar landscapes reveals beauties that busy hands never pause to notice. The voices of family members take on new significance when they constitute the primary available entertainment. The Sabbath creates space for reflection, for the kind of interior examination that busy schedules rarely permit. In the silence between morning and evening services, between the completion of minimal necessary tasks and the approach of Monday's renewed labor, you find time to consider questions that transcend immediate survival: the meaning of your existence, the nature of your relationship with the divine, the purpose that underlies the endless cycle of work and rest, planting and harvest, birth and death that defines human experience. This enforced contemplation serves not only individual spiritual needs but community social functions as well. Sunday becomes the day when neighbors visit, when family relationships receive attention that weekday schedules cannot accommodate, when the bonds that hold communities together are reinforced through shared experience of worship, rest, and conversation. The prohibition against individual labor creates opportunities for collective spiritual and social activities that strengthen the fabric of medieval society. As the day progresses toward evening and the prospect of renewed work grows nearer, you might find yourself grateful for this imposed pause in life's relentless demands. The rest may have felt burdensome at times. The restrictions may have chafed against your desire for productivity. But the Sabbath has provided something that voluntary leisure rarely achieves: complete separation from the anxieties and pressures that dominate ordinary days, space for the soul to expand beyond the narrow confines of material necessity. The evening service brings Sunday to its formal conclusion, but the day's influence extends beyond the church doors and into the week that follows. Having been forced to rest, to reflect, to remember that human existence encompasses more than mere survival, you return to Monday's labor with perspective that pure productivity cannot provide. The Sabbath becomes not just a day of rest, but a reminder that work serves life rather than the reverse, that spiritual health requires regular pauses in material pursuits, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is nothing at all. The morning mist clings to the cobblestones as you make your way through the market square, your mind already turning toward the possibilities that a new trade might offer. The endless cycle of agricultural labor has grown wearisome. The thin soil of your rented plot yields barely enough to survive, and the thought of learning a craft that might provide greater security and prosperity fills you with hope that feels almost dangerous in its intensity. Perhaps you might become a baker, rising before dawn to tend ovens that fill the town with the intoxicating aroma of fresh bread. Or maybe blacksmithing calls to you, the forge fire casting dramatic shadows while you shape iron into tools that serve essential functions in every household. The weaver's trade offers its own attractions, transforming raw wool into cloth that protects against weather and adorns the human form with color and texture that speak of skill and artistry. But as you approach the workshop of a craftsman whose trade interests you, as you rehearse the words with which you will offer your services as an apprentice, the reality of medieval economic organization settles upon your shoulders like a yoke carved from stone and reinforced with iron chains. The guild system that governs every aspect of commercial and manufacturing activity in this world recognizes no distinction between ambition and presumption, between individual desire and collective authority, between personal dreams and social control. The guilds of medieval Europe were far more than simple associations of craftsmen banded together for mutual protection and professional advancement. They constituted parallel governments that exercised authority over their members' lives with power that rivaled that of kings and nobles, controlling not only the technical aspects of production but the social, economic, and even moral dimensions of their members' existence. To work outside the guild system was to place oneself beyond the protection of organized society, while to work within it required submission to rules and authorities that might prove more restrictive than the agricultural serfdom from which you seek to escape. Consider the elaborate hierarchy that governs entry into any established trade. At the bottom stand the apprentices, usually boys of 12 or 14 whose families have negotiated contracts that bind them to master craftsmen for periods that stretch from 7 years to more than a decade. These young people surrender their youth, their freedom, and often their health to masters who provide training, shelter, and subsistence while extracting labor that far exceeds the value of instruction received. The apprentice system creates a captive workforce that masters exploit with impunity, secure in the knowledge that guild rules prevent apprentices from seeking better conditions elsewhere. Above the apprentices stand the journeymen, skilled workers who have completed their training but lack the resources or connections necessary to establish independent workshops. These men wander from town to town seeking employment, carrying their tools like holy relics and their guild membership like letters of introduction to a closed society that recognizes no currency but demonstrated skill and proven loyalty. Yet even journeymen remain subject to guild authority, forbidden to work for non-members or to practice their trades in territories controlled by rival organizations. At the apex of this system reign the master craftsmen, those who have successfully navigated the treacherous passage from apprentice through journeyman to independent workshop owner. Yet even these apparent success stories remain bound by guild rules that dictate everything from the quality of materials they may use to the prices they may charge, from the number of apprentices they may train to the techniques they may employ in their work. The guilds that elevate masters to positions of authority simultaneously constrain that authority within boundaries designed to preserve collective control over individual ambition. The masterpiece tradition illustrates both the sophistication and the exclusivity of guild culture. Before achieving recognition as a master craftsman, the aspiring candidate must create a work of such exceptional quality that it demonstrates complete mastery of traditional techniques, while showcasing the innovation and creativity that justify elevation to the highest rank of the profession. Yet the existing masters who judge these submissions possess every incentive to maintain high standards, not from pure dedication to quality, but from desire to limit competition and preserve their own privileged positions within the guild hierarchy. This process of evaluation becomes particularly problematic when social and economic factors influence supposedly objective assessments of technical skill. A wealthy candidate whose family possesses resources to purchase expensive materials and whose connections provide access to advanced techniques enjoys significant advantages over poorer competitors whose masterpieces must demonstrate equivalent skill using inferior resources. The guild system, despite its rhetoric of meritocracy and professional standards, often perpetuates existing social hierarchies rather than challenging them. The economic functions of guilds extend far beyond simple quality control to encompass price regulation, market allocation, and the kind of commercial coordination that modern societies achieve through government oversight and legal frameworks. Guild authorities negotiate with civic leaders to secure exclusive rights to practice particular trades within specific territories, creating monopolies that benefit members while restricting consumer choice and limiting economic innovation. These arrangements protect established craftsmen from competition, while ensuring that municipal authorities can rely upon predictable sources of essential goods and services. Yet the guild system also provides benefits that pure market competition often fails to deliver. Quality standards maintained through guild oversight protect consumers from fraudulent or dangerous products, while training programs ensure that traditional skills pass from generation to generation without degradation or loss. The social welfare functions of guilds provide support for disabled members, widows of deceased craftsmen, and others whose circumstances might otherwise lead to destitution. Guild halls serve as community centers where members gather for religious observances, social events, and the kind of mutual support that isolated individuals cannot provide for themselves. For you standing outside the workshop where you hope to begin a new career, these complex realities translate into immediate practical challenges. Gaining admission to a guild requires not only demonstrated aptitude for the chosen trade, but also social connections, financial resources, and the kind of political skill that allows navigation of bureaucratic hierarchies jealous of their prerogatives and suspicious of outsiders. The master craftsman whose workshop attracts your interest may welcome additional labor but hesitate to sponsor a candidate whose background or connections might reflect poorly upon his own standing within the guild structure. The financial obligations associated with guild membership begin with apprenticeship fees paid to masters and continue through the journey period with dues, assessments, and the expenses associated with creating a masterpiece worthy of acceptance by existing masters. Even successful completion of this process leads not to freedom but to a different form of dependence, as master craftsmen discover that guild membership requires ongoing submission to collective authority over individual business decisions. The geographic restrictions imposed by guild territories mean that membership in one organization may provide no protection or recognition in neighboring towns where different guilds exercise authority over the same trades. A baker trained in one city may find his skills worthless in another where local guild rules prohibit outsiders from practicing their crafts, while a blacksmith whose techniques satisfy masters in his home territory may discover that different regions demand different approaches to the same fundamental processes. Yet despite these obstacles and restrictions, despite the years of subordination and the costs of membership, despite the ongoing constraints upon individual freedom and creativity, the guild system represents your best hope for escaping the limitations of agricultural labor and achieving the kind of security and prosperity that independent farming rarely provides. The path may be long and difficult, the requirements may seem arbitrary and burdensome, but membership in a recognized guild offers protection against competition, access to markets, and the respect that society accords to skilled craftsmen whose work requires intelligence as well as strength. As you approach the workshop door, as you prepare to offer your services and submit to whatever conditions the master craftsman might impose, you carry with you not only your own ambitions and dreams, but the hopes of family members whose survival may depend upon your success in this new endeavor. The guild system that seems so restrictive and demanding also represents opportunity, the chance to transform yourself from an anonymous agricultural laborer into a recognized member of a skilled profession. From someone whose daily bread depends upon the vagaries of weather and harvest into someone whose livelihood rests upon human need for the products of intelligence applied to raw materials. The transaction you contemplate involves more than simple employment or even career change. You propose to enter a world where individual identity becomes inseparable from professional affiliation, where social status derives from demonstrated competence in specialized skills. where economic security depends upon membership in organizations that transcend individual lives and connect personal success to collective welfare. In seeking to join a guild, you seek to join not merely a trade but a form of civilization that transforms individual competition into cooperative achievement, personal ambition into community prosperity, private skill into public benefit. The bronze voice of the church bell cuts through the evening air like a blade through silk, its resonant call rolling across thatched roofs and cobblestone streets with the authority of centuries. But this is no ordinary summons to prayer or announcement of civic occasion. This is the sound that governs time itself in the medieval world, the bronze heartbeat around which all human activity must synchronize or face the consequences of temporal rebellion. You pause in your evening tasks, perhaps finishing the last few stitches on a garment whose completion could provide much-needed income, or cleaning tools that tomorrow's work will require, or simply enjoying a brief moment of personal time when the day's obligations finally permit individual choice. But the bell tolerates no competing priorities, acknowledges no personal preferences, recognizes no distinction between convenience and duty. When it speaks, all other voices must fall silent, all other activities must cease, all other clocks must bow to its bronze supremacy. The medieval relationship with time bears little resemblance to our modern obsession with precision and personal control over temporal resources. Clocks as we understand them do not exist in this world, and the concept of individual time management remains as foreign as the idea of personal flight or instantaneous communication across vast distances. Instead, time belongs to the community, administered by religious and civic authorities whose bells divide the day into segments designed to serve collective rather than individual needs. Picture a world where no private person owns time, where the rhythm of life flows not from personal choice, but from communal decision, where the very concept of being late or early depends entirely upon external signals over which ordinary people exercise no control. The church bell tower rises above the community like a temporal lighthouse, its bronze beacon cutting through the confusion of individual desire to impose order upon the chaos of human activity. The system operates with elegant simplicity that masks profound complexity. Different bells signal different activities, the call to morning prayer that marks the official beginning of the day, the work bells that summon laborers to their tasks, the meal bells that announce when eating is permitted and expected, the curfew bells that command the extinguishing of fires and the beginning of night's enforced rest. Each sound carries specific meaning understood by everyone within hearing distance, creating a form of temporal communication that requires no literacy, no personal timepieces, no individual interpretation. Yet this apparent simplicity conceals a sophisticated system of social control that extends far beyond mere scheduling. The bells teach submission to authority by demanding immediate response to external commands, regardless of personal inclination or private need. They create community-wide synchronization that makes collective action possible while rendering individual autonomy nearly impossible. They establish rhythms of activity and rest that serve institutional needs rather than personal preference, transforming every member of society into a component of a vast temporal machine governed by bronze voices and ecclesiastical authority. Consider the psychological impact of living entirely according to external time signals. Your day begins not when your body awakens naturally or when personal circumstances suggest that rising would be advantageous, but when the bell tower announces that dawn has officially arrived and community activity must commence. Your meals occur not when hunger strikes or when food preparation is complete, but when bronze voices declare that eating time has been scheduled by authorities whose knowledge of your personal needs may be limited, but whose power to control your temporal existence remains absolute. The working day unfolds in segments, determined not by the natural rhythm of tasks or the logical flow of productive activity, but by bells that interrupt concentration, fragment attention, and subordinate individual efficiency to collective scheduling. You may be in the middle of delicate work that requires sustained focus, or engaged in heavy labor that has found its natural pace, or involved in social interaction that serves important personal or professional purposes. But when the bell rings, everything stops, everything changes. Everything yields to the bronze authority that recognizes no competing claims upon temporal allegiance. The social stratification of medieval society becomes visible in the differential impact of bell-controlled time upon various classes and occupations. Nobles enjoy certain exemptions from the most rigid aspects of temporal control, maintaining private schedules within their castles and manor houses while still acknowledging the broader framework of religious and civic timekeeping. Wealthy merchants can sometimes negotiate flexibility in their response to temporal commands, particularly when commercial opportunities require deviation from community schedules. But for you, along with the vast majority of medieval society, bell time represents a form of temporal servitude that shapes every aspect of daily existence. You rise when commanded, work when directed, eat when permitted, rest when ordered, and sleep when the bronze voices finally grant permission for unconsciousness. Your personal sense of temporal need and preference remains subordinated to collective scheduling that treats individual variation as a form of social disruption requiring correction and control. The bells serve functions beyond mere scheduling, operating as a communication system that connects every member of the community to information about collective circumstances and shared concerns. Different bell patterns announce different types of events, emergencies that require immediate community response, religious observances that demand participation, civic celebrations that call for public gathering, warnings about approaching dangers that threaten collective security. In a world without newspapers, radio, television, or any other form of mass communication, the bell tower functions as the community's central information hub, broadcasting essential news through bronze voices that penetrate every corner of the settlement. Yet this system of temporal control also creates opportunities for community coordination and social cohesion that purely individual time management cannot achieve. When everyone responds to the same temporal signals, when all members of society organize their activities according to shared rhythms, when collective needs take precedence over personal preferences, the result is a level of social synchronization that enables complex group activities ranging from religious worship to military defense to large-scale construction projects. The religious dimensions of bell-controlled time deserve particular attention, as they reveal the deeper spiritual purposes underlying what might otherwise appear to be merely practical scheduling arrangements. The bells that call the community to prayer serve not only to announce worship opportunities, but to sanctify time itself, transforming ordinary temporal progression into sacred rhythm that connects earthly existence to eternal spiritual reality. Each bell stroke becomes a prayer, each temporal segment becomes a meditation, each synchronized community response becomes an act of collective worship that transcends individual spiritual practice. The agricultural implications of community timekeeping create both benefits and challenges for farming communities whose survival depends upon careful attention to natural rhythms that may not coincide with bronze-announced schedules. Planting, harvesting, and animal husbandry follow biological and meteorological patterns that ignore human temporal preferences. Yet the bell system requires agricultural activities to conform to community schedules that may conflict with optimal farming practices. The tension between natural time and social time creates ongoing challenges for rural communities caught between environmental necessity and institutional authority. As you listen to the evening bells announcing the end of another day structured around bronze commands, as you prepare to yield your individual temporal autonomy to the collective schedule that will govern tomorrow's activities, you participate in a form of civilization that values community coordination above personal freedom, institutional authority above individual preference, shared rhythm above private choice. The bells that seem to imprison you within temporal structures beyond your control also connect you to a community whose survival depends upon the kind of collective discipline that only shared submission to external authority can achieve. In yielding to bell time, in accepting bronze voices as the ultimate arbiters of when and how you organize your daily activities, you contribute to a social experiment that seeks to balance individual needs against collective requirements, personal desire against community welfare, private convenience against public order. The success of this experiment, measured in the survival and prosperity of medieval communities across centuries of challenge and change, suggests that temporal freedom may be a luxury that societies struggling for survival cannot afford. and that the bronze voices calling across medieval villages and towns carry within their metallic tones the accumulated wisdom of generations who learned that sometimes the greatest individual benefit comes from accepting collective control over the most basic aspects of human existence. The wooden tub sits before your hearth like a promise of cleanliness that remains perpetually just beyond reach, its rough-hewn planks stained with the memory of countless washing attempts that never quite achieved the purification they sought. Steam rises from the buckets of water you have hauled from the well, precious liquid heated over fires that consume wood better used for cooking or warmth, and for a brief moment you allow yourself to imagine the luxury of true cleanliness, the sensation of skin scrubbed free from the accumulated grime of daily labor. But even as you contemplate this simple pleasure, even as your hands test the water's temperature, and your body anticipates the relief that a proper bath might provide, the weight of authority settles upon your shoulders like a heavy cloak woven from prohibition and suspicion. The bathhouse that once served your community stands shuttered and silent, its doors barred by official decree, its windows darkened by laws that equate cleanliness with moral corruption and communal bathing with spiritual danger. The closure of public bathhouses across medieval Europe represented more than mere civic policy or religious preference. It embodied a fundamental shift in social attitudes toward the human body, toward communal activity, toward the relationship between physical pleasure and spiritual purity. What had once been accepted as natural and necessary human activity became suspect, dangerous, potentially heretical behavior that threatened not only individual souls but the moral fabric of entire communities. The bathhouses of earlier medieval periods had served functions that extended far beyond simple hygiene. They operated as social centers where news was exchanged, business conducted, relationships formed, and community bonds strengthened through shared experience of relaxation and mutual care. Men and women of various social classes mingled in environments that temporarily suspended some of the rigid hierarchies that governed other aspects of medieval life, creating spaces where common humanity took precedence over artificial distinctions of birth and wealth. Yet these same qualities that made bathhouses valuable as community institutions also made them threatening to authorities concerned with maintaining social control and moral discipline. The relaxation of class boundaries that occurred in bathing environments challenged the stable hierarchies that medieval society considered essential for political and social order. The mixing of sexes in various states of undress suggested possibilities for improper behavior that strict religious teachings sought to prevent. The atmosphere of pleasure and indulgence that surrounded communal bathing conflicted with Christian emphasis upon denial of bodily desires and suspicion of physical comfort. The emergence of new diseases, particularly syphilis and plague, provided public health justifications for policies that might otherwise have appeared purely moralistic or politically motivated. Medical understanding of the period, limited as it was by lack of scientific knowledge about disease transmission, nevertheless recognized connections between crowded conditions and illness spread, between shared facilities and infection rates, between communal activities and epidemic disease. The bathhouse, with its warm, moist environment and constant circulation of people from different communities, seemed to present ideal conditions for the spread of whatever mysterious forces caused illness to leap from person to person. Yet the health arguments for bathhouse closure, however sincere, cannot fully explain the enthusiastic support that such policies received from religious authorities already suspicious of any institution that seemed to promote bodily pleasure over spiritual discipline. The Church's growing emphasis upon the corruption of flesh and the danger of sensual indulgence found perfect expression in opposition to communal bathing, which appeared to celebrate precisely those aspects of human nature that Christian teaching sought to suppress. For you, standing beside your inadequate wooden tub with its shallow pool of lukewarm water, the closure of public baths means confronting the impossibility of achieving anything approaching true cleanliness through private efforts alone. The water that seemed abundant when carried from the well appears pitifully insufficient when compared to the deep pools that once welcomed entire communities. The soap that costs so much to purchase from traveling merchants dissolves quickly in the limited liquid available, leaving behind residues that might clean your skin but cannot cleanse your soul of the frustration that accompanies perpetual inadequacy. The process of private bathing, conducted in the cramped confines of single-room dwellings, shared with family members whose own hygiene needs compete for the same scarce resources, lacks the luxury and thoroughness that public facilities once provided. Water must be heated bucket by bucket over fires that could better serve other purposes, while privacy must be improvised through hanging cloths or carefully timed absences that may not align with optimal bathing conditions. The result is usually a hasty and incomplete washing that provides psychological rather than physical satisfaction, a gesture toward cleanliness rather than its actual achievement. The social implications of bathhouse closure extend beyond mere inconvenience to encompass fundamental changes in community structure and interpersonal relationships. The loss of spaces where people of different social classes interacted informally contributed to increased rigidity in social hierarchies, as opportunities for cross-class contact diminished and mutual understanding became more difficult to achieve. The elimination of venues where news and information circulated freely reduced the flow of communication that had previously helped bind communities together, creating more isolated and insular social units. The economic consequences of bathhouse prohibition affected not only the proprietors of such establishments, but also the broader networks of suppliers, employees, and ancillary businesses that had developed around the bathing industry. Soap makers, towel weavers, firewood suppliers, water carriers, and numerous other trades lost important markets when public bathing ceased to be legally and socially acceptable. The resulting economic disruption contributed to the impoverishment of communities already struggling with the various challenges that characterized medieval life. The irony of bathhouse closure becomes particularly apparent when contrasted with the continued operation of similar institutions in other parts of the world where different religious and cultural traditions maintained more positive attitudes toward communal bathing and bodily cleanliness. While European authorities worried about the moral and physical dangers of public baths, other societies continued to enjoy the health benefits and social advantages that such institutions provided, suggesting that the problems attributed to bathhouses might have been culturally constructed rather than inherently inevitable. The private bathing that replaced communal facilities created new forms of inequality based upon access to resources necessary for individual cleanliness. Wealthy households could afford the fuel, water, soap, and labor required for regular private bathing, while poorer families struggled to achieve even minimal cleanliness using methods that consumed disproportionate amounts of their limited resources. The result was a society where cleanliness became increasingly associated with social status, where the ability to maintain personal hygiene served as a visible marker of economic success or failure. The psychological impact of reduced bathing opportunities affected not only individual comfort but community attitudes toward the human body and its needs. As cleanliness became more difficult to achieve and maintain, tolerance for dirt and odor necessarily increased, creating communities where what would have been considered unacceptable uncleanliness in earlier periods became the normal condition of daily life. This adaptation to lower standards of hygiene may have had health consequences that medieval people could not fully understand, contributing to illness rates and life expectancies that reflected not only economic hardship but also the cumulative effects of inadequate sanitation. Yet perhaps the most significant consequence of bathhouse closure was its contribution to changing attitudes toward pleasure and indulgence in daily life. The elimination of one of the few socially acceptable forms of bodily pleasure available to common people sent clear messages about the proper relationship between physical comfort and spiritual development, between communal enjoyment and individual salvation, between immediate gratification and eternal reward. The lesson taught by closed bathhouses was that earthly pleasure, however innocent it might appear, carried hidden dangers that prudent people would avoid in favor of more spiritually beneficial activities. As you lower yourself into the shallow water of your inadequate tub, as you attempt to scrub away the grime of honest labor using resources that seem insufficient for the task, you participate in a form of compromise between cleanliness and practicality, between individual needs and social constraints, between personal comfort and collective discipline. The bath you take cannot match the luxury or effectiveness of communal facilities that once served your community, but it represents an assertion of human dignity and personal care that even the most restrictive authorities cannot entirely eliminate. The warm water, limited though it may be, provides momentary relief from the constant presence of dirt and sweat that accompanies physical labor in a world where cleanliness remains always just beyond complete achievement. The soap, expensive though it may be, creates briefly the illusion of purification and renewal that helps maintain psychological as well as physical health. The privacy, cramped though it may be, allows for personal intimacy with your own body that communal facilities could never provide, creating opportunities for self-care and reflection that may compensate partially for what has been lost through the elimination of public bathing. In this daily compromise between desire and reality, between need and availability, between indivisibility, between individual preference and social constraint, you embody the broader challenges that characterize medieval existence. The closed bathhouse that haunts your memory represents not only lost convenience but also lost community, lost pleasure, lost opportunities for the kind of simple human enjoyment that makes survival more than mere endurance. Yet the private bath you create from limited resources represents resourcefulness and determination, the refusal to surrender entirely to circumstances beyond your control. The insistence upon maintaining whatever dignity and cleanliness remain possible in a world that seems increasingly hostile to both. The flickering candlelight dances across the handful of coins in your palm, their metal surfaces catching and reflecting the warm glow like tiny suns captured in bronze and silver. These coins represent weeks of back-breaking labor, careful saving, and the kind of meticulous financial planning that survival in the medieval world demands. Tonight, for the first time in months, you possess enough money to contemplate something beyond mere subsistence, to consider the possibility of purchasing not just what you need, but what you might actually want. The merchant's stall in tomorrow's market calls to your imagination with promises of velvet, soft enough to make angels weep, of silk that flows like captured moonlight, of furs that speak of warmth and comfort beyond anything your current circumstances provide. You have seen these treasures displayed for the wealthy, watched nobles and prosperous merchants select fabrics with casual indifference to costs that would impoverish your family for a generation. Yet tonight, with coins in your hand and hope in your heart, you dare to dream of joining their ranks, if only briefly, if only in the superficial realm of appearance. But even as you count and recount your modest wealth, even as you plan the transformation that better clothing might work upon your social standing and personal confidence, the familiar weight of legal reality settles upon your shoulders like a cloak woven from prohibition and punishment. The sumptuary laws that govern medieval society recognize no distinction between temporary indulgence and permanent presumption, between aspiration and arrogance, between the desire to look better and the crime of looking above your station. These laws, written in the stern language of absolute authority and enforced with the full power of medieval justice, divide society into visible categories as rigid and unmistakable as the stone walls that separate castle from cottage. Your clothing serves not merely as protection against weather or modesty against exposure, but as a uniform that announces your place in the great hierarchy of human worth, your rights and limitations, your value as measured by those who possess the power to make such determinations. The velvet that attracts your longing gaze in the marketplace carries invisible barriers more impenetrable than castle walls. This fabric, with its luxurious texture and rich depth of color, belongs exclusively to the nobility whose blood and birth grant them privileges that no amount of honest labor can purchase. The very threads from which velvet is woven seem infused with aristocratic essence, transformed by law and custom into material that would corrupt common flesh through contact, that would mark peasant wearers as criminals deserving punishment rather than admiration. Purple, that most royal of colors, exists in a realm so far above your social station that even looking upon it too longingly might constitute a form of visual trespass. This hue, extracted from rare creatures through processes that cost more than most families earn in lifetimes, carries within its depths the concentrated essence of divine right and hereditary privilege. To wear purple without proper authorization would represent not merely fashion crime but political rebellion, a challenge to the natural order that God and King have established for the governance of human society. The furs that line noble cloaks and trim aristocratic garments come from animals whose very lives belong to the upper classes, creatures whose deaths serve to warm bodies deemed worthy of such luxury by accident of birth rather than merit of character. Ermine, with its pure white beauty marked by strategic spots of contrasting darkness, becomes in noble hands not merely fur but symbol, not merely warmth but statement, not merely clothing but proclamation of superiority that echoes across every social interaction. Yet the enforcement of these sartorial restrictions extends far beyond simple prohibitions written in dusty legal codes. Networks of inspectors and informants patrol markets and public gatherings, their eyes trained to detect the slightest deviation from approved dress codes, their authority backed by courts whose judgments can destroy lives with the same casual efficiency that nobles display when selecting their wardrobes. These officials possess encyclopedic knowledge of fabric types, color variations, and decorative elements, enabling them to identify violations that might escape less trained observation. The punishments for sartorial transgression reflect the seriousness with which medieval society views challenges to its established order. Fines levied against clothing violations can impoverish families for generations, while public humiliation serves to reinforce social boundaries through spectacle that educates entire communities about the consequences of aspiring beyond one's assigned place. Physical punishments, though less common, send unmistakable messages about the ultimate price of refusing to accept the visual hierarchies that maintain social stability. Consider the merchant who achieves modest prosperity through years of careful trading, accumulating wealth sufficient to purchase fabrics previously beyond his reach, only to discover that legal restrictions prevent him from wearing the outward signs of his economic success. His gold coins, earned through honest labor and shrewd business practice, cannot purchase the social recognition that appropriate clothing might provide, leaving him trapped between his humble origins and his improved circumstances, unable to express his achievement through the visual language that medieval society employs to communicate status and worth. The tragic irony of sumptuary laws becomes apparent when examining their stated purposes alongside their practical effects. Ostensibly designed to maintain social order by preserving visible distinctions between classes, these regulations actually highlight the artificial nature of such distinctions by requiring legal enforcement to maintain what should, if natural and proper, maintain itself through inherent superiority. The very need for laws preventing social climbing through fashion suggests that the boundaries between classes are more fragile and permeable than aristocratic ideology would admit. The economic implications of clothing restrictions extend beyond individual purchasing decisions to encompass entire industries and trade relationships. Craftsmen who possess the skill to create luxury items find their potential markets artificially limited by laws that restrict consumption to narrow segments of the population, while international trade in valuable fabrics and dyes must navigate legal frameworks that treat certain commodities as inherently dangerous to social stability. The result is an economic system that prioritizes political control over commercial efficiency, social hierarchy over market freedom. Yet the enforcement of sumptuary laws faces constant challenges from human nature itself, from the persistent desire for self-improvement and social advancement that no amount of legal prohibition can entirely suppress. Black markets in forbidden fabrics develop alongside legitimate commerce, while creative interpretations of legal language allow some individuals to approach the boundaries of permissible dress without crossing into explicit violation. The constant tension between individual aspiration and legal restriction creates an atmosphere of surveillance and suspicion that permeates every aspect of commercial and social life. The religious dimensions of clothing regulation reflect deeper theological concerns about pride, vanity, and the proper relationship between earthly appearance and spiritual condition. Church authorities who support sumptuary laws argue that excessive attention to personal appearance represents a form of idolatry that distracts souls from their eternal salvation, while the pursuit of inappropriate clothing reflects sinful pride that God will surely punish in this life or the next. Yet critics might observe that such reasoning conveniently supports existing power structures while placing the burden of spiritual discipline primarily upon those who possess the least rather than the most. The psychological impact of living under constant sartorial surveillance affects not only individual behavior, but community relationships and personal identity formation. When every public appearance requires careful calculation of legal compliance, when every purchase of clothing must be weighed against potential legal consequences, when every desire for better appearance must be suppressed in favor of assigned uniformity, The result is a society where self-expression becomes dangerous and personal improvement becomes criminal. As you sit by your hearth, counting coins that represent possibilities you are forbidden to pursue, contemplating purchases that law prevents you from making, you embody the fundamental tension between human aspiration and social control that characterizes medieval existence. The money in your hands could purchase transformation, dignity, and beauty, yet the same society that enabled you to earn these coins prohibits you from spending them in ways that might elevate your appearance above your assigned station. The velvet will remain in merchant stalls reserved for noble customers, its luxurious texture forever beyond your touch. The silk will continue to flow like captured light across the bodies of those whose birth grants them privileges that no amount of hard work can earn. The furs will warm aristocratic shoulders while you continue to shiver in wool, your comfort sacrificed to maintain social distinctions that benefit others at your expense. Yet perhaps in understanding these restrictions, in recognizing the forces that shape and limit your choices, you gain a different kind of wealth that no sumptuary law can regulate or confiscate. The knowledge of how power operates, how social hierarchies maintain themselves, how individual desires become collective policies, how personal disappointments serve larger purposes. This understanding provides its own form of luxury that transcends material possessions, its own form of dignity that external clothing cannot diminish, its own form of freedom that legal restrictions cannot entirely destroy. The coins remain in your palm, their weight unchanged by the dreams they cannot fulfill, their value undiminished by the purchases they cannot make. Tomorrow you will return them to your hidden savings, adding them to the small hoard that represents security rather than transformation, survival rather than improvement, endurance rather than elevation. But tonight, in the flickering candlelight of your humble dwelling, you have touched possibility even if you cannot grasp it, have imagined transformation even if you cannot achieve it, have dreamed of dignity even if you cannot wear it. In this moment between hope and resignation, between desire and acceptance, between aspiration and reality, you participate in the great human drama that transcends historical periods and social systems. The sumptuary laws that constrain your choices are expressions of power that will eventually pass away, but the human spirit that dreams of something better, that refuses to accept limitations as permanent, that finds ways to maintain dignity despite restrictions, this spirit endures beyond all attempts to suppress it, carrying within itself the seeds of eventual transformation that no legal code can prevent forever. The stew pot bubbles over the small fire that provides both warmth and cooking capability in your single-room dwelling, its contents a monotonous mixture of cabbage, onions, and whatever scraps of grain you have managed to preserve from yesterday's meager allocation. The thin broth that results from this combination provides sustenance of a sort, but calls forth no enthusiasm from either stomach or spirit. Your children gather around the pot with expressions that blend gratitude for any food at all with the weary resignation of those who know that culinary excitement remains forever beyond their reach. Yet, as you contemplate this humble meal, as you prepare to ladle its watery contents into wooden bowls that have seen countless identical servings, your mind wanders inevitably toward forbidden territories of taste and satisfaction. In the markets where you cannot afford to shop, vendors display foods that seem to belong to a completely different universe of flavor and nutrition. White bread, soft and fine, calls to hungry eyes accustomed to the coarse darkness of barley loaves. Roasted meats glisten with juices that speak of satisfaction. Your body has almost forgotten how to crave. Fresh fruits imported from distant regions offer colors and sweetness that exist only in dreams for families like yours. But these visions of culinary abundance are not merely economic fantasies beyond your purchasing power. They represent legal impossibilities, social transgressions, crimes against the established order that governs not only what you can afford to eat, but what you are permitted to desire. The food laws of medieval Europe, while less visible and dramatic than clothing restrictions, nevertheless carve society into separate realms of nourishment that reflect and reinforce the same hierarchical principles that govern every other aspect of daily existence. The white bread that attracts longing glances in the baker's stall is not simply expensive food but forbidden fruit, literally prohibited to those whose social station marks them as unworthy of such refinement. This bread, made from wheat flour that has been sifted and processed until only the finest particles remain, represents not merely superior nutrition but social privilege that cannot be purchased with money alone. The labor required to produce such refined flour, the fuel needed to bake it properly, the skill necessary to achieve its perfect texture, all of these contribute to its cost, but its prohibition extends beyond economic considerations to encompass fundamental questions about who deserves the best that human culture can provide. Your daily bread, by contrast, reflects your place in the social hierarchy through its very composition and appearance. The barley and rye that comprise its substance speak of practicality rather than pleasure, of survival rather than satisfaction, of duty rather than desire. Its dark color marks it immediately as peasant food, while its dense texture and coarse grain remind your mouth with every bite that you belong to the class of people for whom eating represents necessity rather than enjoyment, fuel rather than pleasure, endurance rather than celebration. The meat that rarely graces your table when it appears at all comes from animals whose lives and deaths are carefully regulated by laws that recognize no distinction between hunger and criminality. The venison that might provide protein sufficient to sustain your family for weeks belongs legally to noble hunters whose recreational activities take precedence over your survival needs. The fowl that nest in nearby forests, the fish that swim in local streams, the wild boar that damage crops while remaining protected from peasant hunters, all of these potential sources of nourishment exist in a legal realm that places them forever beyond your reach. When meat does appear in your stew, it comes from domestic animals whose deaths represent economic disasters as much as temporary culinary improvements. The chicken whose body flavors tonight's broth will no longer lay eggs to supplement your family's nutrition, while the pig whose flesh might sustain you through winter's hunger will no longer provide the breeding stock necessary for future survival. Every meat meal thus becomes a choice between immediate satisfaction and long-term security, between present pleasure and future possibility. The vegetables that form the foundation of your diet carry their own messages about social status and legal restriction. Cabbage, that sturdy survivor of harsh weather and poor soil, becomes the inevitable companion of every meal, its sulfurous smell and bitter taste serving as constant reminders of limitation and constraint. Onions provide flavor when more desirable seasonings remain beyond reach, while leeks and turnips fill stomachs without satisfying souls hungry for variety and pleasure. Yet even within these restrictions, subtle gradations of quality and availability create hierarchies that reflect the complex stratification of medieval society. The merchant who cannot afford white bread might still purchase wheaten loaves that surpass your barley sustenance, while the prosperous farmer might enjoy dairy products and preserved meats that remain luxuries for landless laborers. Each level of society looks upward with longing toward foods that seem tantalizingly within reach, while looking downward with gratitude toward circumstances they have avoided through luck or effort. The seasonal rhythms that govern food availability create additional layers of restriction and opportunity that shape eating patterns according to natural rather than legal limitations. Spring brings tender greens that provide relief from winter's preserved monotony, while summer offers fresh vegetables that transform meals from mere survival exercises into experiences approaching pleasure. Autumn's harvest creates brief periods of relative abundance that must be carefully preserved against winter's inevitable return to scarcity and limitation. The preservation techniques that extend food availability throughout the year create their own forms of culinary hierarchy based upon access to resources necessary for proper storage and processing. Salt, that precious commodity that prevents spoilage and adds flavor, costs more than many families can afford, forcing reliance upon smoking, drying, and fermentation methods that may preserve nutritional value while diminishing taste and texture. The wealthy who can afford adequate salt enjoy preserved foods that retain much of their original character, while the poor must accept preservation methods that transform familiar flavors into barely recognizable substitutes. The social functions of food extend far beyond mere nutrition to encompass ceremonial, religious, and political dimensions that transform every meal into a statement about relationships, obligations, and hierarchies. Feast days bring temporary suspensions of normal dietary restrictions, creating opportunities for communities to experience abundance and variety that remind everyone of what they normally lack while reinforcing social bonds through shared indulgence. Wedding banquets, funeral meals, and religious celebrations provide occasions when food becomes theatre, where the display of abundance demonstrates prosperity and generosity while the distribution of special foods reinforces social relationships and political alliances. Yet these exceptional occasions serve to highlight rather than obscure the daily reality of restriction and limitation that characterizes normal eating patterns for the vast majority of medieval society. The feast that provides temporary abundance makes the return to ordinary meals seem more rather than less inadequate, while the memory of better food serves as a constant reminder of what life might offer if circumstances were different, if social position were higher, if legal restrictions were less severe. The religious dimensions of food regulation add additional layers of complexity and restriction to eating patterns already constrained by economic and social limitations. Fasting days transform meals from inadequate sustenance into spiritual discipline, while dietary prohibitions require choices between immediate physical needs and eternal spiritual consequences. The Church's authority over food selection extends beyond mere scheduling to encompass fundamental questions about the relationship between bodily satisfaction and soul salvation, between earthly pleasure and heavenly reward. As you serve the thin cabbage stew to your family, as you watch your children consume their portions with the mechanical efficiency of those for whom eating has become duty rather than pleasure, you participate in a daily meditation on inequality and endurance that characterizes the broader experience of medieval existence. The food that fills your bowls provides the minimum nutrition necessary for survival, while serving as a constant reminder of everything that remains beyond your reach, everything that law and custom reserve for others whose birth or wealth grants them access to abundance you can only imagine. The empty pot that remains after the meal, its bottom scarred by countless scrapings and its sides stained by years of similar servings, becomes a symbol of limitation accepted and deprivation endured. Yet perhaps in that acceptance lies its own form of dignity, its own form of strength, its own form of victory over circumstances that seek to diminish human worth to the level of animal survival. The family that shares simple food with grace and gratitude demonstrates values that transcend material abundance, relationships that survive economic hardship, love that flourishes despite external limitation. In transforming necessity into sacrament, in finding meaning within restriction, in creating family bonds around inadequate meals, you accomplish something that all the white bread and roasted meat in the world cannot provide. You transform survival into dignity, endurance into strength, limitation into opportunity for demonstrating the human capacity to find joy and meaning even in circumstances that seem designed to crush both. The twilight deepens as you sit beside the dying embers of your fire, contemplating the strange irony of a world that provides abundance for some while denying sustenance to others, that creates laws to protect privilege while ignoring need, that transforms food from gift into weapon, in the ongoing struggle between those who possess power and those who merely possess hunger. Yet in understanding these patterns, in recognizing the forces that shape your limitations, you gain a form of nourishment that no meal can provide, the knowledge that your circumstances, however difficult, do not define your worth, your dignity, or your essential humanity. The morning mist clings to the forest floor like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their hold upon the earth, and through this ethereal veil you move with the careful stealth that necessity has taught you. Your stomach gnaws with the familiar ache of insufficient nourishment, while your family waits at home for whatever providence might provide to supplement the meager stores that dwindle with each passing day. The trap in your hands, woven from precious wire that cost more than you could afford, represents hope and desperation in equal measure, the tools of survival in a world that seems determined to prevent your use of them. Before you, partially hidden in the underbrush where morning shadow meets filtered sunlight, stands a deer of magnificent proportions. Its coat gleams with the rich brown of autumn leaves, while its alert eyes scan the forest for dangers that should include you but may not. If luck and skill combine in your favor, this creature, pausing in its morning search for forage, could provide your family with meat sufficient to sustain them through the approaching winter, protein enough to transform their pale faces and strengthen their weakening bodies, nourishment that might mean the difference between survival and slow starvation. Yet even as your hands move toward the trap, even as your mind calculates angles and distances and possibilities, the weight of legal reality settles upon your shoulders like a cloak woven from chains of iron and threads of fear. That deer, beautiful and life-sustaining though it may be, belongs not to the forest, not to nature, not to the God who created it, but to the Lord whose hunting preserve extends across these woodland acres like an invisible cage that protects animals from desperate humans, while ensuring that noble recreation takes precedence over peasant survival. The poaching laws of medieval Europe were not gentle suggestions offered by nobles concerned with wildlife conservation or ecological balance. They were absolute prohibitions backed by the full power of feudal authority, designed to preserve hunting rights as symbols of social dominance while denying sustenance to those whose need might be greatest but whose social position rendered such need irrelevant to legal consideration. Every forest creature, from the mightiest stag to the humblest rabbit, carried upon its life the protection of laws that valued noble pleasure above common survival. Consider the bitter mathematics of this legal system. A single hunting party organized for the entertainment of aristocratic guests might slaughter more deer in an afternoon than your entire village could consume in a year. Yet your taking of one animal to prevent your family's starvation would constitute a capital crime worthy of the most severe punishment. The abundance that surrounds you in the forest remains as untouchable as if it were protected by walls of stone and guarded by armies of soldiers, transformed by legal decree from natural resource into private property that serves recreational rather than nutritional purposes. The enforcement of hunting laws required networks of gamekeepers, forest wardens, and informants whose authority extended far beyond simple wildlife protection to encompass surveillance and control of rural populations, whose poverty might tempt them toward illegal solutions to their subsistence problems. These officials possessed powers of search and seizure that penetrated private homes, questioned family members, and investigated any evidence that might suggest poaching activity. A suspicious stain on clothing, an unexplained improvement in family nutrition, even the testimony of neighbors seeking to deflect suspicion from their own activities could trigger investigations that destroyed lives and scattered families. The punishments for poaching reflected the seriousness with which medieval society viewed challenges to property rights and social hierarchy, but they also revealed the extent to which legal systems served the interests of power rather than justice. Death sentences for taking animals that nobles slaughtered for sport demonstrated that the crime lay not in killing wildlife, but in violating social boundaries, not in reducing animal populations but in challenging the exclusive privileges that hunting rights represented. Lesser punishments, including mutilation, imprisonment and financial penalties, served to mark violators permanently, while deterring others who might contemplate similar acts of desperation. Yet despite these harsh consequences, poaching continued throughout the medieval period, driven by needs that made legal risk seem preferable to certain starvation. Entire communities sometimes collaborated in illegal hunting activities, sharing both the dangers and the rewards of challenging laws that prioritized privilege over survival. These underground networks developed sophisticated techniques for avoiding detection, from silent snares that killed without sound to communication systems that warned of approaching authorities to methods of butchering and preserving meat that left minimal evidence of illegal activity. The seasonal rhythms of forest life created opportunities and challenges for both poachers and the authorities who pursued them. Winter, when game animals grew lean and desperate enough to venture closer to human settlements in search of food, provided easier hunting but also increased surveillance from officials aware that hunger might drive law-abiding citizens toward criminal activity. Spring brought abundant wildlife but also renewed patrol activity as nobles prepared for their own hunting seasons and demanded clear forests for their recreational pursuits. The social dynamics of poaching extended beyond simple economic crime to encompass forms of resistance and rebellion that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying feudal society. When peasants took deer from noble preserves, they asserted claims to natural resources that transcended legal ownership, rights based upon need rather than birth, justice founded upon survival rather than privilege. These acts, however small and localized, represented cracks in the ideological foundations that supported medieval social hierarchy. The irony of hunting laws became most apparent during periods when overpopulation of protected animals led to agricultural damage that threatened the very survival of rural communities. Deer and boar that nobles preserved for their hunting pleasure could devastate crops that represented the only protection against famine for entire villages. Yet the farmers whose livelihoods were destroyed remained legally prohibited from defending their fields against these protected destroyers. The system that preserved animals for noble recreation thus actively contributed to peasant starvation while preventing the natural solutions that ecological balance might otherwise provide. The psychological burden of living surrounded by abundance that remained legally untouchable affected rural communities in ways that extended far beyond immediate nutritional concerns. Children grew up, knowing that forests teeming with life could not provide sustenance for their families, while adults learned to suppress hunting instincts that evolution had developed over millennia as survival mechanisms. The constant presence of food that could not be legally obtained created a form of psychological torture that transformed natural environments from sources of comfort and security into symbols of deprivation and powerlessness. The religious dimensions of hunting laws added additional complexity to already difficult moral calculations. Church teaching about divine providence and acceptance of earthly circumstances conflicted with natural instincts towards self-preservation and family protection, while religious emphasis upon obedience to earthly authority challenged spiritual beliefs about divine justice and care for the poor. Priests found themselves caught between theological requirements to support legitimate authority and pastoral duties to comfort those whose suffering resulted from the exercise of such authority. As you crouch in the forest shadows, as you watch the deer move slowly through the clearing where your trap might succeed in providing salvation for your family, you face choices that transcend simple questions of legal compliance or economic necessity. The decision whether to attempt this illegal hunt involves fundamental questions about the relationship between human law and natural right, between social obligation and family loyalty, between acceptance of injustice and resistance to oppression. The deer pauses, its head raised as if sensing your presence, its body poised for flight at the first sign of danger. In that moment of suspension, you embody all the tensions and contradictions that characterize medieval existence, the struggle between duty and desire, between law and need, between acceptance and rebellion. The creature before you represents both salvation and destruction, both hope and despair, both survival and catastrophe. Whatever choice you make in this moment will carry consequences that extend far beyond your immediate circumstances. Success in taking this deer might provide temporary relief from hunger while creating permanent vulnerability to legal retribution. Failure to act might preserve your legal safety while condemning your family to continued suffering and possible starvation. Either path leads through territories fraught with danger and uncertainty, through landscapes where survival itself becomes a form of moral complexity that offers no clear guidance for action. The forest around you holds its breath as if waiting for your decision, as if recognizing that this moment contains within itself all the larger questions about justice and survival, law and necessity, privilege and desperation that define the medieval world. In choosing whether to set your trap or abandon your plans, whether to risk everything for the chance of sustenance or accept continued hunger as the price of legal compliance, you participate in the great ongoing negotiation between power and powerlessness that shapes human history across all periods and societies. The deer moves on, disappearing into the deeper forest where your trap cannot reach it, where your hunger cannot touch it, where it remains forever protected by laws that value its life more highly than yours. The opportunity passes like morning mist, leaving behind only the familiar weight of resignation and the endless question of how long acceptance of injustice can coexist with the basic human drive towards survival and dignity. Yet perhaps in this moment of restraint, in this choice to honor law despite personal cost, in this acceptance of hunger rather than risk of punishment, you demonstrate something valuable that transcends immediate material concerns. The discipline required to walk away from available food when your family needs sustenance, the moral strength necessary to choose legal compliance over natural survival instincts, the dignity inherent in accepting suffering rather than inflicting it upon others through the consequences of illegal action. These qualities may provide forms of nourishment that no venison could supply, forms of strength that no physical sustenance could create. In the end, As you return home empty-handed to face the disappointed eyes of children whose hunger you could not satisfy, whose needs you could not meet, whose suffering you could not prevent, you carry with you the knowledge that you have remained true to principles larger than immediate necessity, laws that may be unjust, but whose violation would create additional suffering rather than reducing it. This knowledge may not fill empty stomachs or strengthen weakening bodies, but it preserves something essential about human dignity that mere survival purchased at any cost might ultimately destroy. The sound of your own breathing seems unnaturally loud in the pre-dawn darkness, as you stand before the assembled witnesses whose faces blur together in the flickering torchlight like masks worn by actors in some macabre theatrical performance. Your hands shake not from cold but from the fear that runs through your body like ice water, while your mind struggles to comprehend how the simple act of reaching for a loaf of bread has led to this moment of supernatural judgment where divine will must speak through human flesh to determine guilt or innocence. The magistrate's voice cuts through the morning air with the sharp edge of absolute authority as he explains the procedure that will determine your fate through methods that seem to belong more to the realm of nightmare than legal proceedings. Trial by ordeal, he calls it, though the words sound like funeral bells tolling in the distance, each syllable carrying the weight of centuries of tradition that places complete faith in divine intervention, while requiring human beings to endure torments that might kill the innocent as readily as the guilty. Before you on the altar that serves as both sacred space and instrument of justice, lies the red-hot iron bar that will become the measure of your righteousness, its metal surface glowing like a fragment of the sun itself while heat radiates from it in waves that make the surrounding air shimmer with demonic intensity. This tool of revelation, heated in fires that consumed precious fuel for the sole purpose of bringing divine judgment to earthly disputes, represents the medieval world's absolute confidence in supernatural justice combined with its willingness to subject human flesh to extremes of suffering in pursuit of spiritual truth. The logic underlying this system appears both elegant and terrifying in its simplicity. If you are innocent of the crime with which you stand accused, then surely the God who sees all things and judges all hearts will protect your flesh from harm, allowing you to grasp the burning metal and carry it the prescribed distance while suffering no lasting injury. If you are guilty, then divine justice will permit the iron to sear your flesh, marking you with wounds that will fester and corrupt as physical proof of spiritual guilt, visible evidence that heavenly authority has rendered its verdict through the medium of earthly pain. Yet as you stare at the glowing metal that awaits your touch, as you feel its heat against your face like the breath of some furnace demon, practical considerations intrude upon spiritual faith with the insistence of physical reality. Your knowledge of burns acquired through daily contact with fires and hot implements tells you that no human flesh can grasp red-hot iron without immediate and severe damage, that the protection of divine intervention would need to suspend natural laws in ways that your experience suggests rarely occur, that the odds of surviving this ordeal without permanent injury remain small regardless of your guilt or innocence. The crowd that has gathered to witness this trial by divine judgment represents a cross-section of your community, faces familiar from market days and religious services, neighbors who have known you since childhood, yet who now observe your predicament with the mixture of fascination and dread that public spectacles of suffering have always attracted. Some expressions reflect sympathy for your plight, while others suggest suspicion about your guilt, but all reveal the morbid curiosity that draws people to witness moments when ordinary human existence intersects with supernatural forces in ways that promise either miracle or catastrophe. The religious implications of the ordeal system extend far beyond simple criminal justice to encompass fundamental questions about the relationship between divine will and human suffering, between faith and doubt, between acceptance of earthly authority and trust in heavenly justice. The church officials who preside over these proceedings claim to serve as intermediaries between human law and divine judgment, yet their interpretation of burn patterns and healing rates carries enormous potential for bias, error, and manipulation that could transform genuine religious observance into elaborate justification for predetermined verdicts. Consider the medical realities that make ordeal outcomes nearly inevitable, regardless of divine intervention. In a world without antiseptics or advanced wound care, severe burns almost invariably become infected, while the primitive understanding of healing processes leads to interpretations of natural biological responses as supernatural communications. The festering that accompanies untreated burn wounds becomes evidence of divine displeasure, while the rare cases of relatively clean healing provide confirmation of divine protection, though such outcomes may have more to do with individual immune responses and chance than with spiritual innocence. The social functions served by trial by ordeal reveal aspects of medieval justice that extend beyond simple determination of guilt or innocence to encompass community reinforcement of shared values, public demonstration of divine authority, and spectacular display of the consequences that await those who challenge established order. These proceedings become theatrical events that educate through terror, teaching through suffering, reinforcing social cohesion through collective witness of individual punishment or vindication. Yet the psychological trauma inflicted by ordeal proceedings affects not only the accused, but entire communities forced to watch neighbors submit to torments that may destroy innocent people while failing to identify actual criminals. The sight of human flesh burning, the sound of anguish that no amount of faith can entirely suppress, the smell of seared skin that lingers in memory long after wounds have healed or victims have died. These sensory experiences create collective memories that shape community attitudes toward justice, authority, and the nature of divine intervention in human affairs. The economic costs of trial by ordeal extend beyond the immediate expenses of fuel, metal, and official supervision to encompass the broader social costs of a legal system that may remove productive community members through death or permanent disability regardless of their actual guilt or innocence. When ordeal procedures kill or maim innocent people, communities lose not only individuals but their contributions to collective survival, their skills and knowledge, their roles in family and social networks that extend far beyond their personal circumstances. The alternatives to ordeal that existed in some regions and periods suggest that medieval society possessed other means of determining guilt and innocence, methods based upon witness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and rational deliberation rather than supernatural intervention. Yet the persistence of ordeal procedures despite these alternatives reveals the extent to which medieval culture preferred religious authority to human judgment, divine will to earthly wisdom, spectacular demonstration to careful investigation. As you extend your hand toward the glowing iron, as you feel its heat intensifying with each inch of approach, as you prepare to grasp metal that will either vindicate your innocence through miracle or confirm your guilt through mutilation, you embody the intersection of faith and doubt that characterizes medieval existence. Your willingness to undergo this trial demonstrates either complete confidence in divine justice or total desperation in the face of earthly authority, either absolute trust in spiritual protection or resigned acceptance of probable destruction. The moment of contact between flesh and metal becomes a test not only of divine favor but of human endurance, not only of spiritual innocence but of physical courage, not only of legal guilt but of faith itself. The pain that shoots through your hand and arm as you lift the burning iron, the smell of your own flesh cooking, the sound that escapes your lips despite your determination to remain silent, these immediate realities compete with spiritual beliefs about divine protection and supernatural intervention in ways that challenge the very foundations of the ordeal system. Whether your hand heals cleanly in the days that follow, whether infection sets in and spreads through your body, whether the community interprets your wounds as evidence of guilt or innocence, the experience of trial by ordeal will mark you permanently as someone who submitted to medieval justice in its most extreme and terrifying form. The scars you carry will serve as constant reminders of a legal system that sought truth through suffering, divine will through human pain, spiritual guidance through physical torment. In choosing to undergo ordeal rather than confess to crimes you may not have committed, in placing your trust in divine justice despite its earthly representatives' potential for error and bias, in accepting pain as the price of maintaining your innocence, you participate in one of the most distinctive and disturbing aspects of medieval civilization. Whether you emerge vindicated or condemned, whether you survive with minimal damage or suffer permanent disability, whether you find your faith strengthened or shattered by this experience, you will have touched something essential about the medieval worldview that sought divine guidance in human suffering and found spiritual truth in physical trial. The ordeal ends, but its consequences continue long after the iron has cooled and the wounds have formed their initial scabs. The verdict rendered through your flesh will determine not only your immediate fate, but your permanent standing in a community that has witnessed your trial and drawn its own conclusions about divine judgment and human guilt. In this moment when supernatural and natural, divine and human, spiritual and physical intersect in the reality of burned skin and community witness, you embody all the contradictions and complexities that make medieval existence simultaneously magnificent and terrifying, profoundly spiritual and brutally practical, deeply faithful and utterly unforgiving. And so our journey through these ancient mists begins to draw toward its close, though the stories we have touched could fill countless nights with their telling. We have walked alongside those who rose at bell towers' bronze commands, who dressed according to laws that clothed their station in visible thread, who ate what authority permitted rather than what hunger craved. We have witnessed the strange justice of ordeals, the enforced rest of Sabbaths, and the closed doors of bathhouses where cleanliness became a privilege reserved for few. But our path now leads us northward, across seas that challenge the bravest hearts, toward lands where ice and determination forge different kinds of stories. Here in the year 985, as medieval Europe settles into its patterns of hierarchy and control, other souls prepare to write their names upon territories that exist more in hope than in any map drawn by human hands. The longships that gather in Icelandic fjords carry more than mere passengers and provisions. They bear dreams heavy as iron, hopes bright as sailcloth catching wind, and the kind of desperate courage that turns exile into exploration, punishment into possibility. Eric the Red, standing at the prow of his vessel while Arctic mist swirls around him like the breath of sleeping gods, embodies the restless spirit that refuses to accept limitation as permanent condition, that transforms banishment into opportunity for greatness beyond the vision of those who pronounce judgment. Yet before we follow those sails toward their icy destination, before we witness the extraordinary courage of families who chose uncertainty over safety, abundance over security, we must first understand the forces that drove them from familiar shores toward waters where death swims alongside hope in equal measure. Iceland itself had become crowded with the dreams of Norwegian emigrants, its valleys filled with the farms of those who sought independence from kings and jarls whose authority weighed upon shoulders like yokes of iron and gold. The island that had once seemed vast enough to contain every exile's ambition now pressed against the boundaries of possibility, its limited land divided among settlers whose children needed inheritance, whose herds required pasture, whose futures demanded space that no longer existed within the familiar borders of their adopted home. Into this pressure cooker of Norse ambition came the violent disputes that seemed to follow Erik Thorvaldsson like storm clouds follow thunder. Blood feuds and legal troubles marked his path through Icelandic society, each conflict spawning greater conflicts, each settlement breeding new grievances, until the Thing Assembly of Iceland itself decreed that the land could no longer contain this particular storm-bearer whose presence threatened the fragile peace that island life required. Banishment in the Norse world carried consequences that extended far beyond mere inconvenience or temporary displacement. To be outlawed meant to exist outside the protection of society, beyond the reach of law's benefits, while remaining subject to its punishments, vulnerable to any who chose to collect bounties or settle scores without fear of legal retaliation. For most exiles, such sentences meant death disguised as justice, execution deferred until distance and isolation completed what formal judgment had begun. But Eric possessed qualities that transformed exile from death sentence into opportunity, vision that could see possibilities where others perceived only obstacles, leadership that could convince others to share his dangerous dreams, and most importantly, the kind of reckless courage that makes heroes of those who might otherwise become merely footnotes in the sagas of greater men. The stories that drew Eric westward came from sailors blown off course by storms that Arctic waters breed like scattered seeds, tales of land glimpsed through fog and ice, where no human foot had left its mark upon shore or mountainside. These reports, fragmented and uncertain though they might be, spoke to something deep within the Norse soul that valued exploration above safety, discovery above comfort, the unknown above the familiar constraints of settled existence. Yet even Eric, bold though he might be, understood that successful colonization required more than personal courage and individual determination. The land that waited beyond Iceland's western horizon demanded not heroes but families, not warriors but farmers, not conquerors but settlers willing to transform wilderness into home through generations of patient labor and stubborn endurance. The genius of Eric's approach lay not in military strategy or administrative planning, but in the art of persuasion, the ability to paint visions bright enough to overcome rational fear, compelling enough to inspire others to abandon security for possibility, beautiful enough to transform exile into exodus, punishment into pilgrimage towards something approaching promised land. When Eric named his discovery Greenland, he created more than mere geographical designation. He crafted advertisement, promise and hope rolled together in 2 syllables that spoke to Norse hearts hungry for the kind of opportunity that their ancestors had found when they first sailed beyond the boundaries of their continental homeland. The name itself became argument for the journey, justification for the risk, compensation for the losses that such ventures inevitably demanded. The preparations for this unprecedented voyage required resources and cooperation that tested every relationship Eric had managed to preserve through his turbulent career in Iceland. Ships needed provisioning for journeys that might last weeks through waters where no rescue could come. Livestock required transportation across seas that could turn deadly in moments. Families needed convincing that uncertain prospects in unknown lands offered better futures than familiar hardships in familiar places. The fleet that finally assembled in Icelandic harbors represented one of the most ambitious undertakings in the history of human migration, a conscious attempt to transplant an entire culture across oceanic barriers that had previously seemed insurmountable. Men and women who had never seen the sea beyond familiar coastlines prepared to entrust their lives and futures to wooden vessels no larger than modern city blocks, carrying everything they owned toward destinations that existed more in hope than in knowledge. Children who barely understood the concept of travel found themselves selected as colonists for a land their parents had never seen, their young lives transformed into investments in futures that might never arrive, stakes placed upon games of chance played with Arctic weather and unknown coastlines. The elderly, who should have ended their days among familiar graves instead, began journeys toward territories where their bones might rest in soil that no Norse ancestor had ever touched. The livestock that crowded ship decks represented more than simple provisions for the journey ahead. These animals embodied the agricultural foundations upon which any successful colony must rest. The breeding stock that could transform wild land into productive farms, the living capital that would make survival possible in territories where trade remained impossible and self-sufficiency offered the only hope of avoiding starvation. Women who left Iceland for Greenland carried within their sea chests not only personal possessions but the cultural treasures that would preserve Norse identity in exile. Looms for weaving, patterns for decoration, stories for teaching children, songs for celebrating seasons, traditions for marking births and deaths and marriages that would bind communities together despite the isolation that Arctic residents would impose. The moment of departure, when sails caught wind and familiar shores began to diminish toward the horizon, marked more than simple geographical transition. These emigrants crossed thresholds between known and unknown, between security and adventure, between identities rooted in ancestral soil and futures that would be earned through courage and carved from ice and stone. The journey itself tested every assumption about human endurance and divine favor that Norse culture had developed through centuries of seafaring experience. The North Atlantic Ocean between Iceland and Greenland possessed no islands where travelers could rest, no coastlines where ships could shelter from storms, no landmarks where navigation could confirm position or direction. This was sailing into void, trusting wind and current and luck to carry precious cargo of human hope across waters that seemed designed to swallow such presumption without trace. Days at sea became exercises in communal endurance as families crowded together in spaces barely adequate for storage, sharing air thick with the smell of frightened animals and seasick passengers, rationing food and water while praying to gods whose attention might be focused elsewhere, maintaining hope while witnessing the kind of suffering that makes heroes of those who survive to tell their stories. The storms that struck these vulnerable vessels carried within their winds all the fury that Arctic waters could summon against human presumption. Waves tall as houses that lifted ships toward clouds before dropping them into valleys deep as graves. Lightning that illuminated desperate faces while thunder seemed to mock the smallness of human ambition when measured against the vast indifference of natural forces. Ships were lost during this crossing, entire families consumed by waters that kept their secrets. Dreams ended before they could be tested against the realities of Arctic settlement. The Saga's record that of 25 vessels that began the journey toward Greenland, only 14 completed it successfully, while the rest disappeared into the kind of maritime tragedy that leaves no monuments except empty places at future feasts. Yet the survivors who finally glimpsed Greenland's forbidding coastline through fog and spray had achieved something remarkable in the history of human migration. They had crossed one of the Earth's most dangerous oceanic barriers, carrying with them everything necessary to establish civilization in territories where no civilization had previously existed, where success would depend entirely upon their ability to transform courage into competence, hope into reality, dreams into the daily work of survival in one of the planet's most challenging environments. The land that rose from the sea before them bore little resemblance to the Greenland of Eric's promises, but it offered something perhaps more valuable than immediate comfort. The possibility of freedom, the chance to build something entirely new, the opportunity to prove that human determination could overcome even the most daunting obstacles that geography and climate could present. As the first Norse feet touched Greenland's rocky shores, as the first Norse eyes surveyed landscapes that no human gaze had previously comprehended, as the first Norse hands began the work of building homes in territories that tested every skill their culture had developed, they initiated one of history's most remarkable experiments in human adaptation and endurance. These settlers who had followed Eric the Red across impossible waters toward improbable dreams now faced the greatest challenge of all, transforming survival into prosperity, exile into independence, Arctic wilderness into something approaching home. Their success or failure would be measured not in seasons or years but in generations, not in individual achievement but in cultural persistence, not in conquering Greenland but in allowing Greenland to teach them how to become something new while remaining essentially Norse. The story of Greenland's settlement represents more than geographical expansion or colonial achievement. It embodies the human capacity to dream beyond limitation, to risk everything for possibilities that exist only in hope, to transform punishment into opportunity, and exile into exodus toward futures that courage must create from raw materials of ice and stone and stubborn determination. In following Eric the Red and his band of Arctic pioneers, we witness something essential about the medieval spirit that refused to accept boundaries as permanent, limitations as final, impossibility as anything more than challenge waiting for the right combination of vision and audacity to transform it into achievement. These colonists who chose uncertainty over security, hardship over comfort, unknown territories over familiar constraints, demonstrate the restless energy that drives human civilization forward even when logic suggests that staying in place offers the wiser choice. Their story continues beyond the first successful landing, beyond the initial establishment of settlements, beyond the early years of learning how to survive in conditions that test every assumption about what human life requires. It extends across generations of children born in exile who would know no homeland except the one their parents carved from Arctic wilderness, across centuries of adaptation that would prove human culture's remarkable ability to flourish, even in the Earth's most challenging environments. But perhaps most importantly, the saga of Greenland's settlement illuminates the profound truth that home is not discovered, but created, not inherited but earned, not given by geography, but built through the daily work of transforming dream into reality, hope into achievement, exile into the kind of freedom that can only be found beyond the boundaries of what others consider possible. The first winter in Greenland tested every assumption about survival that the Norse settlers had brought with them from Iceland, challenging their skills, their endurance, and their faith in ways that no amount of preparation could have anticipated. The darkness that descended upon their new homeland lasted longer and cut deeper than any they had previously experienced, while cold that seemed to possess its own malevolent intelligence penetrated every shelter they had managed to construct during the brief summer building season. Yet within this crucible of Arctic hardship, something remarkable began to emerge. The families who had risked everything to follow Eric's vision discovered resources within themselves and their culture that they had never been forced to use. Adaptations that transformed Norwegian agricultural techniques into survival strategies suited to conditions that no Norwegian had ever faced. Innovations that bridged the gap between Old World knowledge and New World necessity. The turf houses that rose from Greenland's soil represented more than mere shelter from Arctic weather. They embodied a new form of Norse architecture born from the marriage of traditional building techniques with materials and conditions that demanded unprecedented ingenuity. Strips of sod cut from the limited areas where grass grew thick enough to serve as building material were stacked like green bricks, creating walls that could insulate against cold while remaining low enough to resist the fierce winds that swept down from interior glaciers. Driftwood, carried by currents from distant forests that Greenland itself could not provide, became treasure more precious than silver or gold. Every log that washed ashore received treatment worthy of sacred relics, carefully preserved and allocated for essential construction purposes that meant the difference between adequate shelter and deadly exposure. Women learned to examine each piece of weathered timber with the expertise of master carpenters, determining its best use for door frames, roof supports, or the interior furnishings that made survival more than mere endurance. The integration of living spaces with animal shelters reflected both practical necessity and cultural adaptation that transformed Norse farmstead design to meet Arctic requirements. Cattle, sheep, and goats shared walls with human families not merely for convenience but for the mutual benefit of warmth exchange that made winter survival possible for both species. The breath of animals helped warm the air that humans breathed, while human body heat contributed to the survival of livestock whose milk and wool provided essential resources for community sustenance. Inside these ingenious structures, life developed rhythms and patterns that combined familiar Norse customs with innovations born from Greenland's unique challenges. Families gathered around central hearths where peat and whatever wood they could spare burned with careful efficiency, providing light and warmth while serving as the focal point for activities that bound communities together through the long months when outdoor work became impossible. Women's work expanded beyond traditional Norse domestic responsibilities to encompass new skills that Arctic conditions demanded. Spinning wool and weaving cloth continued as essential activities, but the techniques adapted to make use of Arctic materials and conditions that differed dramatically from those of Iceland or Norway. The preservation of food required methods that took advantage of natural refrigeration while protecting stores from the extreme cold that could make even preserved food inedible. Children born in Greenland grew up with survival skills that their Iceland-born parents had to learn through often painful experience, developing intuitive understanding of weather patterns, ice conditions and resource management that marked them as the first generation of true Greenlanders. Their games and stories reflected the unique environment they inhabited, while their dreams and ambitions took shape around possibilities that existed only in Arctic territories. The community cooperation that developed during these early years established patterns of mutual dependence and shared responsibility that would characterize Greenlandic Norse society throughout its existence. Neighbors shared labor for construction projects that no single family could complete alone, while resources moved between households according to need rather than strict ownership, creating social bonds strong enough to sustain communities through the isolation and hardship that Arctic life imposed. The seasonal rhythms that governed Greenlandic life differed dramatically from those that had structured existence in Iceland or Norway, demanding cultural adaptations that reached deep into the heart of Norse identity and tradition. Summer, brief and precious, became a season of frantic activity when all the year's construction, repair and resource gathering had to be compressed into months that passed with terrifying speed. The haymaking that sustained livestock through winter required techniques adapted to Greenland's climate and vegetation, methods that maximized the nutritional value of grasses that grew differently in Arctic conditions. Every blade of grass became significant, Every sunny day became opportunity that could not be wasted. Every decision about resource allocation carried consequences that would not become apparent until winter tested the wisdom of summer choices. Hunting and fishing expanded beyond their traditional roles in Norse economy to become essential activities that made the difference between survival and starvation. Seals provided not only meat but oil for lamps that could extend usable daylight hours, while their skins served multiple purposes from waterproof clothing to essential household items. Caribou hunting required new skills and techniques adapted to Arctic conditions, while fishing through ice demanded innovations that no Norse angler had previously needed to develop. The preservation of food took on critical importance that transformed traditional Norse methods into life-or-death techniques, requiring precision and expertise that could not be acquired through casual practice. Smoking, drying, and fermentation methods that had served adequately in milder climates needed adaptation to work effectively in Greenland's extreme conditions, while new preservation techniques developed specifically for Arctic resources extended the range of survival strategies available to communities that could not afford failure. Trade relationships with the outside world took on characteristics unique to Greenland's geographical position and resource base, creating economic patterns that differed significantly from those that had sustained Norse communities in other locations. Walrus ivory became the colony's most valuable export, a luxury commodity that could be exchanged for essential goods that Greenland could not produce but could not survive without. The hunting of walrus required skills, equipment, and courage that challenged even experienced Norse hunters, demanding expeditions into dangerous Arctic waters where weather could change without warning and ice could trap hunters far from safety. Yet the ivory these enormous creatures provided created trade relationships that connected Greenlandic settlements to European markets, hungry for materials that only Arctic waters could supply. The gradual development of a distinctly Greenlandic Norse culture reflected the community's success in adapting European traditions to Arctic realities while maintaining connections to the broader Norse world that had given birth to their colonial experiment. Religious practices evolved to incorporate acknowledgement of local conditions and challenges, while maintaining essential elements of Christian faith that connected Greenlandic communities to the universal church. The stone churches that eventually rose in major Greenlandic settlements represented more than religious devotion. They embodied the community's commitment to permanence, their determination to create institutions that would endure beyond individual lifetimes, their faith that the colonial experiment would succeed not just in survival but in establishing lasting civilization in Arctic territories. Marriage customs and family relationships adapted to reflect the realities of small, isolated communities where every individual's contribution carried essential significance for collective survival. Young people growing up in Greenland developed different perspectives on independence and responsibility, understanding from childhood that their personal choices would affect not only their own futures but the survival prospects of their entire community. The educational systems that developed to prepare children for Greenlandic life combined traditional Norse cultural transmission with practical training in skills that no previous generation of Norse children had needed to master. Boys learned hunting and construction techniques adapted to Arctic conditions, while girls mastered domestic skills that incorporated both European traditions and innovations necessary for survival in conditions their ancestors had never faced. The stories and sagas that entertained long winter evenings began to incorporate Greenlandic experiences and achievements, creating new traditions that celebrated local heroes and commemorated local events, while maintaining connections to the broader corpus of Norse cultural heritage. These new stories served not only as entertainment but as educational tools that transmitted essential survival knowledge from one generation to the next. As seasons cycled through their Arctic patterns and years accumulated into decades, the Greenlandic Norse communities began to achieve something remarkable: the successful transplantation of European civilization to territories that seemed designed to resist such attempts. Their success measured itself not in rapid growth or easy prosperity, but in persistence, adaptation, and the gradual development of sustainable ways of life that honored both their ancestral heritage and the demands of their adopted homeland. The children who grew to adulthood in Greenland and established families of their own represented the true measure of the colonial experiment's success. They were Norse in culture and tradition, but Greenlandic in experience and adaptation, embodying the fusion of European heritage with Arctic innovation that made long-term survival possible in one of the world's most challenging environments. Their achievements stood as testament to human adaptability and cultural resilience, proof that civilization could flourish even in conditions that seemed to offer only hardship and limitation. They had transformed Eric the Red's desperate gamble into a sustainable way of life, his exile into freedom, his reckless dream into multi-generational reality that would endure for centuries. Yet their story also carried within it the seeds of future challenges that would test their descendants' ability to maintain what the first generation had created. Climate change, isolation from European markets, competition from other Arctic peoples, and the gradual evolution of European interests and priorities would all contribute to pressures that would eventually challenge the sustainability of the remarkable experiment in Arctic colonization that had begun with Eric's vision and been realized through the courage and persistence of families willing to risk everything for the chance to build something new in the world's most unlikely places. For now, however, as the second and third generations of Greenlandic Norse built upon the foundations their ancestors had laid, as they refined the survival techniques that made Arctic life possible, as they developed cultural traditions that honored both their origins and their achievements, they represented one of humanity's most remarkable success stories. The triumph of vision over limitation, of courage over fear, of persistent effort over apparently impossible obstacles. But our journey through these northern territories carries us beyond the icebound shores of Greenland toward warmer lands where different peoples developed their own distinctive approaches to the fundamental challenges of human existence, where marriage customs reflected values and priorities that both echoed and contrasted with the Norse traditions we have observed in Arctic exile. The Illyrian peoples of the Balkan Peninsula created their own solutions to questions about family formation, social organization, and cultural continuity, solutions that emerged from landscapes where Mediterranean warmth met alpine severity, where ancient traditions encountered changing circumstances, where individual desires negotiated with community requirements in ways that produced customs both beautiful and complex. In the mountainous territories where Illyrian communities flourished, marriage represented more than the joining of two individuals in personal union. It embodied the strategic alliance of family groups whose survival and prosperity depended upon their ability to create networks of mutual support that could withstand the challenges of a world where political boundaries shifted like mountain weather and external threats could emerge from any direction without warning. The young woman who awakens on her wedding morning in an Illyrian village faces a day that will transform not only her personal identity, but her entire social position, her family relationships, her economic circumstances, and her role in community life. Her preparation for this transformation has been occurring throughout her lifetime, through observation of other marriages, through instruction from older women, through participation in the countless daily activities that prepare girls for the responsibilities that marriage will bring. Yet for all this preparation, for all the anticipation and planning that have preceded this day, the bride herself has likely exercised little direct control over the choice of husband or the terms of the marriage agreement that will govern her future life. These decisions have been made by fathers, uncles, and clan elders whose considerations have focused upon family alliances, economic advantages, and political relationships rather than personal compatibility or individual desire. This system of arranged marriage, which might seem restrictive to modern sensibilities, reflects the Illyrian understanding that marriage creates bonds between families rather than merely between individuals. Relationships that will affect entire kinship networks for generations rather than simply the immediate happiness of bride and groom. The choice of marriage partner thus becomes too important to be left to young people whose perspectives may be limited by inexperience and whose emotions may cloud their judgment about decisions that will affect far more than their personal satisfaction. The negotiations that precede Illyrian marriages involve complex calculations about property, status, and mutual obligation that transform wedding arrangements into exercises in diplomatic strategy, Elders from both families meet to discuss not only the immediate terms of the proposed union but the long-term implications for relationships between their kinship groups, the resolution of past conflicts, and the potential for future cooperation in matters ranging from agriculture to defense against external threats. The dowry system that accompanies these negotiations serves multiple functions beyond simple economic exchange. The goods that the bride's family provides, livestock, household implements, clothing, and jewelry, represent both practical resources that will help establish the new household and symbolic statements about the bride's worth and her family's prosperity. These gifts create obligations and expectations that bind the receiving family to treat the bride with respect while establishing her economic security within her new household. Yet the dowry represents only one aspect of the economic relationships that marriage creates between Illyrian families. The groom's family may also provide gifts and guarantees that demonstrate their commitment to the marriage alliance, while establishing their ability to support the bride adequately. These reciprocal exchanges create networks of mutual obligation that extend far beyond the wedding ceremony itself, influencing family relationships for generations. The ceremonial aspects of Illyrian marriage combine religious observance with community celebration in ways that transform individual unions into collective affirmations of shared values and cultural continuity. The fertility rituals that accompany wedding ceremonies reflect deep concerns about the continuation of family lines and community survival, while the public nature of these celebrations ensures that marriage bonds receive community recognition and support. The preparation of the bride involves elaborate rituals that mark her transition from daughter to wife, while honoring both her family of origin and her future household. Elder women from both families participate in ceremonies that prepare her for her new role through a combination of practical instruction and symbolic transformation. Her clothing, jewelry, and ornaments for the wedding day carry meanings that connect her personal transformation to broader cultural themes about femininity, fertility, and social responsibility. The procession that carries the bride from her family's household to her husband's home represents more than simple transportation from one location to another. It constitutes a public ceremony that involves the entire community in witnessing and sanctifying the marriage bond while creating opportunities for both families to display their prosperity and generosity through the elaborate preparations that accompany such events. The wedding feast that celebrates the new marriage provides occasion for communities to demonstrate their cohesion and prosperity, while reinforcing the social bonds that marriage creates between previously separate family groups. The foods served, the entertainment provided, and the gifts exchanged all carry symbolic meanings that extend beyond immediate celebration to encompass broader statements about community values and cultural priorities. The music and dancing that accompany Illyrian wedding celebrations serve functions that transcend mere entertainment, to include cultural preservation, social bonding, and spiritual observance. Traditional songs tell stories that educate younger generations about proper behavior and cultural values, while ritual dances create opportunities for community participation in ceremonies that celebrate not only the specific marriage being solemnized, but the institution of marriage itself as fundamental to community survival and prosperity. The animal sacrifices that often accompany wedding ceremonies reflect Illyrian beliefs about the relationship between human prosperity and divine favor, the need to honor spiritual forces that control fertility and abundance, and the importance of marking significant life transitions through rituals that connect earthly celebrations to eternal spiritual realities. The blood that is spilled and the meat that is shared create bonds between participants while honoring gods whose blessing is essential for marriage success. Yet beneath these elaborate ceremonial observances lie practical concerns about the daily realities that will govern married life in Illyrian communities. The bride who participates in fertility rituals and community celebrations must also prepare for the hard work of establishing and maintaining a household, bearing and raising children, contributing to agricultural production, and fulfilling the countless daily responsibilities that marriage will bring. The economic functions that married women perform in Illyrian society extend far beyond domestic duties to include essential contributions to family prosperity and community survival. Women's work in textile production, food preservation, animal husbandry, and agricultural labor provides resources that families could not obtain through other means, while their roles in child-rearing ensure the continuation of cultural traditions and the training of the next generation in essential survival skills. The social status that marriage confers upon Illyrian women reflects the importance of their contributions to family and community welfare, but it also involves restrictions and expectations that may limit their individual freedom in favor of collective responsibility. Married women gain authority within their households and influence within their communities, but they also accept obligations that will govern their behavior and choices throughout their adult lives. The children born to Illyrian marriages carry within their lives the hopes and investments of extended family networks whose survival may depend upon the success of the next generation in maintaining cultural traditions while adapting to changing circumstances. These children grow up understanding that their personal choices will affect not only their own futures but the welfare of kinship groups whose support has made their existence possible. The marriage customs of the Illyrian peoples thus represent more than quaint traditions preserved from ancient times. They embody sophisticated social mechanisms that address fundamental human needs for security, continuity, and meaningful connection to community and culture. While their specific forms may seem alien to modern sensibilities, their underlying purposes reflect universal human concerns about creating stable relationships, raising healthy children, and maintaining cultural identity across generations. As we witness these marriage ceremonies with their elaborate preparations and community-wide participation, as we observe the transformation of individual lives through participation in customs that connect personal experience to cultural heritage, we encounter insights about human nature and social organization that transcend historical periods and geographical boundaries. The Illyrian bride who accepts her new role and responsibilities embodies the human capacity to find meaning and dignity within social systems that may limit individual choice while providing collective security and cultural continuity. Her story continues beyond the wedding ceremony itself, through the years of marriage that will test the wisdom of her elders' choices, through the births of children who will carry forward the traditions she has inherited, through the daily work of creating and maintaining the family relationships that form the foundation of Illyrian's social organization. In her experience, we glimpse something essential about the human condition, the necessity of balancing individual desires against collective needs, personal fulfillment against social responsibility, immediate satisfaction against long-term welfare. Yet even as we marvel at the complexity and wisdom embedded within Illyrian marriage customs, even as we recognize their effectiveness in creating stable communities and preserving cultural traditions, we must also acknowledge the costs that such systems exact from individuals whose personal inclinations may conflict with social expectations. The bride who submits to arranged marriage may find happiness and fulfillment within the role that has been chosen for her, but she may also sacrifice possibilities that her own preferences might have led her to explore. The balance between individual autonomy and social stability that different cultures achieve through their marriage customs reflects broader questions about human nature and social organization that remain relevant across all historical periods. The Illyrian approach, with its emphasis upon family alliance and community approval, represents one solution to these eternal dilemmas. A solution that prioritizes collective welfare over individual choice while creating mechanisms for ensuring that personal needs receive consideration within broader social frameworks. As our exploration of Illyrian marriage customs draws toward its conclusion, as we prepare for the final movement of our journey through medieval myths and ancient wisdom, we carry with us insights about the human capacity to create meaning and beauty within social constraints, to find dignity and purpose within systems that may limit personal freedom while providing essential security and continuity. These insights prepare us for the culminating portion of our nocturnal journey, where we will encounter the saga of Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking adventurer whose life embodied the restless energy and boundless ambition that characterized the final phase of the Norse expansion across medieval Europe. His story brings together all the themes we have explored: the struggle between individual desire and social constraint, the relationship between personal courage and collective welfare, the tension between tradition and innovation that shapes human civilization. But that tale waits for us beyond the warmth of Illyrian wedding fires, beyond the sounds of celebration that mark new beginnings in ancient communities, beyond the customs that transform individual lives into expressions of cultural wisdom. For now we rest in the glow of ritual flames and the echo of traditional songs, surrounded by the timeless mystery of human societies that find ways to balance freedom with responsibility, innovation with tradition, individual dreams with collective survival. The morning mist that rises from Norwegian fjords carries within its tendrils the promise of destiny, the whisper of saga makers, and the salt taste of ambition that refuses to accept limitation as permanent condition. In the year 1015, as the medieval world settles into patterns of hierarchy and custom that we have observed throughout our journey together, a child draws his first breath in circumstances that seem to guarantee nothing more than ordinary existence within the familiar boundaries of royal politics and dynastic struggle. Yet Harald Sigurdsson, the infant who will one day earn the name Hardrada, the hard ruler, carries within his small frame the condensed essence of Viking ambition, the genetic inheritance of generations who measured worth through courage and achievement rather than birth and comfort. His first cry echoes across landscapes where Norse culture has reached the full flowering of its creative energy, where sagas preserve the memory of heroes whose deeds transcend the limitations of mortality, where the old gods still whisper to those brave enough to listen for voices that Christianity has not entirely silenced. The Norway into which Harald is born represents both the culmination of Viking achievement and the beginning of its transformation into something different, something more settled and civilized. Something that offers greater security, but perhaps less opportunity for the kind of legendary exploits that built the reputations of earlier heroes. Kings now rule from established capitals rather than leading from the prows of longships, while Christianity spreads its message of peace and humility across populations whose ancestors had valued warfare and pride above all other virtues. Harald's father, Sigurd Syr, rules the fertile region of Ringreich with the measured authority of a man who understands that survival in the evolving political landscape of medieval Scandinavia requires diplomacy as much as courage, negotiation as much as warfare, adaptation as much as adherence to traditional values. His household provides young Harald with education in both the old ways of Viking leadership and the new requirements of Christian kingship, preparing the boy for a world that demands mastery of multiple forms of power and influence. Yet it is Harald's mother, Åsta Gud Brandsdatter, who provides the most significant influence upon his developing character and ambitions. Already the mother of Olaf Haraldsson, who will one day become Sante. Olaf and King of Norway, Åsta possesses the kind of political wisdom and personal strength that royal women require to survive and prosper in societies where marriage serves as diplomatic strategy and motherhood becomes a form of state service. Her influence upon Harald extends beyond ordinary maternal care to encompass strategic education in the arts of leadership and the responsibilities of power. The Norway of Harald's childhood teems with opportunity and danger in equal measure, as competing claimants to royal authority struggle for dominance, while external threats from Denmark and England require constant vigilance and preparation. Young nobles like Harald grow up understanding that their personal futures depend not only upon their individual abilities but upon their skill in choosing the right alliances, supporting the correct causes, and demonstrating the kind of leadership that attracts followers while intimidating enemies. The physical presence that Harald begins to develop even in childhood suggests the imposing figure he will become in adulthood. The sagas describe him as unusually tall for his time, eventually reaching heights that would make him remarkable even by modern standards, while his bearing and manner display the natural authority that marks those destined for command. His education includes training in weapons, horsemanship, and the tactical knowledge that medieval warfare demands, but it extends beyond military skills to encompass the arts of poetry, storytelling, and social interaction that Norse leaders require to maintain their positions. The political turmoil that characterizes Harald's early years provides constant education in the realities of power and the consequences of political miscalculation. He watches as his half-brother Olaf struggles to establish and maintain royal authority against the determined opposition of rivals supported by foreign powers, learning through observation the lessons that will later guide his own political career. These early experiences teach him that survival in the royal politics of medieval Scandinavia requires not only personal courage but strategic thinking, flexible alliances, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. The Christianity that spreads across Norway during Harald's youth creates both opportunities and challenges for ambitious young nobles who must navigate between traditional values and new religious requirements. The Church offers powerful allies and valuable administrative support for rulers who can work effectively with clerical authorities, while resistance to Christian conversion provides grounds for political opposition that can be exploited by clever strategists. Harald learns to operate within both systems, maintaining respect for traditional Norse values while accepting the practical necessities that Christian kingship imposes. The Battle of Stiklestad in 1030 provides 15-year-old Harald with his first taste of serious warfare and his first encounter with the kind of political catastrophe that can transform royal princes into exiled fugitives overnight. Fighting alongside his brother Olaf against a coalition of Norwegian rebels supported by Danish military power, Harald experiences both the glory of combat and the devastation of defeat. The bonds of loyalty that unite warriors in battle and the harsh realities that follow when political gambles fail to achieve their intended results. The wounds that Harald suffers at Stiklestad mark him physically while teaching him emotionally about the costs of political ambition and the fickleness of fortune that can elevate heroes one day and destroy them the next. His survival of injuries that kill his brother demonstrates both his physical resilience and his capacity for adapting to circumstances that might overwhelm less determined personalities. The defeat that ends his brother's reign and his own immediate prospects for advancement in Norway becomes the catalyst that launches him upon adventures that will eventually dwarf anything he might have achieved through conventional political success in his homeland. The exile that follows Stiklestad forces Harald to confront fundamental questions about identity, purpose, and the relationship between personal ambition and political loyalty that will shape the remainder of his career. Stripped of the advantages that royal birth had provided, separated from the familiar landscapes and social networks that had defined his early life, he must discover what resources lie within himself, what capabilities he possesses beyond those that circumstance and inheritance had supplied. The decision to seek his fortune in the East, following routes that previous generations of Norse adventurers had established toward the courts of Kievan Rus and the Byzantine Empire, represents more than simple economic opportunism or military service. It embodies Harald's determination to transform exile into opportunity, defeat into education, loss into the foundation for greater achievements than comfortable success in Norway might ever have provided. The journey that carries Harald away from familiar fjords toward the exotic courts and battlefields of Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean world represents a fundamental transformation in his personal saga. The Norwegian prince who departs his homeland as a wounded fugitive will return years later as a veteran commander whose reputation extends across continents, whose wealth rivals that of kings, whose experience encompasses forms of warfare and diplomacy that no previous Norwegian leader has mastered. Yet this transformation requires Harald to surrender not only the security of familiar surroundings but aspects of identity and cultural connection that exile always demands from those who choose adventure over safety, opportunity over comfort, potential achievement over guaranteed mediocrity. The young man who sets out for Kiev and Constantinople carries with him Norwegian values and ambitions, but he must learn to function effectively within political and military systems that operate according to different principles, serve different purposes, and demand different forms of loyalty and service. The years of exile that await Harald will test every aspect of his character while providing opportunities for development that no sheltered royal upbringing could offer. He will learn to command men whose languages he does not speak, to fight in battles where victory depends upon tactics he has never practiced, to navigate political systems where his Norwegian royal blood provides no automatic advantages and may sometimes constitute positive disadvantages. The wealth that Harald will accumulate during his years of Byzantine service, the military reputation that he will earn through campaigns across the Mediterranean world, the diplomatic skills that he will develop through participation in the complex politics of the Eastern Empire. All of these achievements will eventually provide the foundation for his return to Scandinavia and his claim to the Norwegian throne that his brother's defeat had seemed to place forever beyond his reach. Yet the most significant transformation that exile will work upon Harald involves not his external circumstances, but his internal development, his evolution from a Norwegian prince whose horizons were limited by the boundaries of Scandinavian politics into a European figure whose vision encompasses possibilities that transcend national boundaries and traditional limitations. The experiences that await him in foreign courts and distant battlefields will broaden his perspective while deepening his understanding of power, leadership, and the relationship between personal ambition and political achievement. The Harald Hardrada, who will eventually return to claim the Norwegian crown, will embody both the preservation of traditional Viking values and their adaptation to the requirements of a world that has changed dramatically during his years of absence. His saga will demonstrate both the continuing relevance of Norse ideals of courage, loyalty, and achievement, and their transformation through contact with the broader medieval world that extends far beyond the familiar boundaries of Scandinavian experience. As we follow Harald's path from the smoke and carnage of Stiklestad toward the glittering prospects that await him in eastern courts and Mediterranean campaigns, we witness something essential about the human capacity to transform limitation into opportunity, defeat into education, exile into the foundation for achievements that exceed anything that comfortable success might have provided. His story embodies the restless energy that drives civilization forward, the refusal to accept circumstance as destiny, the determination to create meaning and purpose through personal effort rather than inherited advantage. The young warrior, who limps away from the battlefield where his brother died and his own immediate political future perished, carries within himself the seeds of adventures that will eventually make him one of the most remarkable figures of the medieval world. His exile represents not the end of his story, but its true beginning, not the defeat of his ambitions, but their transformation into possibilities that no one, including Harald himself, can yet imagine. In the courts of Kiev and Constantinople, on the battlefields of Sicily and the Levant, through campaigns that will test his courage while expanding his vision, Harald Hardrada will discover what lies beyond the boundaries of ordinary achievement, what becomes possible when talent meets opportunity, when ambition encounters circumstance, when the restless energy of the Viking spirit finds expression through the complex politics and endless conflicts of the broader medieval world. His saga, like all the greatest stories that emerge from human experience, demonstrates that limitation exists primarily in imagination, that boundaries serve mainly to be transcended, that the most remarkable achievements often grow from the most unpromising circumstances. The exile that begins in defeat and desperation will eventually produce a figure whose influence extends across continents, whose achievements inspire admiration and fear in equal measure, whose life story embodies the eternal human quest for meaning and purpose that transcends the accidents of birth and circumstance. But those adventures await us in the mists beyond immediate telling, in the shadowy realms where saga meets history, where individual achievement intersects with collective destiny, where the personal story of one remarkable man illuminates universal truths about courage, ambition, and the human capacity to transform dreams into reality through persistent effort and unwavering determination. For now, as young Harald turns his back upon the familiar landscapes of his Norwegian homeland and sets his face toward the unknown territories that will shape his destiny, we witness the moment when limitation transforms into possibility, when exile becomes the first step toward legendary achievement, when the end of one story provides the beginning of another that will eventually encompass adventures beyond anything that the peaceful fjords of Norway could contain or imagine. The saga continues, as all the greatest sagas do, beyond the boundaries of comfort and familiarity, into realms where courage must create its own opportunities, and where the human spirit discovers what becomes possible when it refuses to accept limitation as permanent, defeat as final, exile as anything more than the necessary prelude to achievements that will echo through the centuries long after the immediate circumstances that produced them have faded into the mists of historical memory. And so our own journey through these ancient mists draws toward its gentle close, though the echoes of the stories we have shared will continue to resonate long after our voices fade into the silence of satisfied sleep. We have walked together through worlds where strange laws govern daily existence, where Viking courage carved civilization from Arctic ice, where marriage customs bound communities together across generations, where individual ambition wrestled with collective necessity in the eternal human struggle to balance freedom with responsibility, desire with duty, dreams with the demanding realities of survival in an uncertain world. The medieval Europe we have explored tonight exists now only in memory and imagination, preserved in chronicles and sagas, archaeological remains and cultural traditions that carry forward the wisdom of generations who learned to endure against overwhelming odds while maintaining dignity, purpose, and hope in circumstances that might seem designed to crush all three. Their stories speak to something eternal in human nature, something that transcends historical periods and geographical boundaries, something that connects their struggles with our own continuing quest for meaning and purpose in existence that often seems arbitrary and indifferent to human desire. The sumptuary laws that dictated medieval clothing choices may seem quaint or oppressive to modern sensibilities, but they reflect enduring questions about social organization, individual expression, and the relationship between personal freedom,